Are you searching for the best in online black radio? Then go to blacktalkradionetwork.com, helping you filter through the noise. Real talk, black talk.
The internet is full of half-truths and all-out lies. We've all seen them, and many people on social media complaining about it. Here's your chance to show and prove. WorldAfropedia.com is a black-owned and operated encyclopedia. There are several thousand articles, but we need help. We can't uncover all the truth ourselves. So please, join us and become a writer, editor, or blogger for WorldAfropedia.com today. Every little bit counts. We owe it to the future generations to put the truth out there. Visit WorldAfropedia.com, the African-centered encyclopedia, a global database of African knowledge for the purpose of bringing about global African wisdom and understanding. WorldAfropedia.com.
As South Carolina pulled down the Confederate flag from State House grounds, the statue of avowed segregationist and former governor and U.S. Senator Pitchfork Ben Tillman watched. Tillman's statue seems safe for now. Republican legislative leaders, Democrats in the General Assembly, and civil rights leaders aren't calling for it to come down. But there are calls to at least make sure the memorial to Tillman tells more of the story than what is currently on there, which reads in part, "Loving them, he was the friend and leader of the common people." Unless the legislature gathers a 2/3 majority vote to fulfill the requirement of South Carolina's Heritage Act, historical monuments from town squares to State House grounds will remain in their places for now.
Context of White Supremacy. Gus T Renegade in for another broadcast, hopefully to share constructive information on the system of white supremacy. Today's date, Friday, July 31st, 2015. So I have been told. This is our 6th study session on Ben Tillman and the Reconstruction of White Supremacy. The author is Stephen Kantrowitz. He is a white male, racist suspect. We are more than halfway through the book, getting close to the home stretch. We should have a few more weeks of reading to go. I hope it has been constructive for folks who are following along. We're picking up on page 151. Page 151, we are on the second paragraph, should be kind of at the top of 151 for folks who are following along. We will go ahead and get started. This week is pretty explicit, and there would be a plethora of cowbells for all of our reading this week. So keep all that in mind. Also keep in mind that, again, the author is a white person, so you want to be alert to possible ways that the book is written in a manner that supports racism, white supremacy. Definitely make sure that we remain vigilant for that. But let's prepare. Hopefully it'll be a constructive investment of our Friday evening. Again, this is Ben Tillman and the Reconstruction of White Supremacy, Context of White Supremacy, audio segment number 1. As the November election approached, Tillman proudly contrasted South Carolina's democratic orthodoxy with the populists' inroads in neighboring Georgia and North Carolina. He explained to an admirer that we have had a hot fight and have been between the D and the deep C, which was to say the third party on one hand and Haskellism on the other. But by good generalship, we have kept the party together and are in better shape than any other southern state. Indeed, South Carolina's populists fared quite poorly by comparison with their regional counterparts. Alone among the former Confederate states, South Carolina was tardy in selecting representatives to the People's Party's National Committee. The Cotton Plant's editor finally announced a state third-party ticket, including presidential electors, just 2 weeks before the November election. Nationally, the populist ticket won over 1 million votes, but no Southern electors, and South Carolina was one of the few Southern states where populism was reduced to insignificance. You cannot divide without bringing ruin, Tillman had told audiences of white men, and divide they did not, at least not in the casting and counting of ballots. Tillman was only correct in boasting that good generalship had carried the day if that generalship is understood to have been conducted over most of the preceding 2 decades. Many of Tillman's critical anti-populist battles have been won not since 1890, but during the 1870s and 1880s, when he helped bring an end to Reconstruction and establish the white supremacist limits of state-level reform. By the time he became governor, he had already helped shape a state political culture that severely limited white men's room for maneuver on matters of racial hierarchy and federal power.
At the same time, he had crafted an explicitly white supremacist alternative to producerist radicalism, one that limited legitimate collective action not just to white men but also to white male farmers who forswore interracial political activity. His tactical skills served him well in 1892, but they alone would not have sufficed. In South Carolina, as throughout the South, no populist coalition could succeed even momentarily unless it could draw on both black and white support. By the 1890s, however, white radicals' own fear and ambivalence about black political participation, rooted in their experience of the past quarter century, made such a call all but unthinkable. Indeed, even the few white populists of 1892 made no overt move to attract black support. Some white radicals understood the need to pierce the slogans of white supremacy and expose the racial demagoguery of their enemies, but they did not know how to confront the expectations that gave Tillman's message its potency. Even agrarian radicals, who proudly declared themselves opposed to monopoly in all its forms, found it difficult to describe democratic citizenship in terms that transcended the particular experiences of white men. White populists struggled, mostly without success, to reconcile their economic analysis with their historic and daily experiences of white manhood. The most famous divided mind of white Southern populism belonged to Georgia's Tom Watson, whose intellectual and political biography has been a major historiographical battleground for populism's analysis. But local, less dramatic cases better explain the structural weaknesses of populism in South Carolina. Take the case of Alliance leader Colonel Ellison S. Keat and his son Joseph, who along with cotton plant editor J.W. Bowden became the state's leading third-party activists. The elder Kite predicted that a coming revolution would pit the farmers, mechanics, wage workers, and laborers, the wealth producers of the nation, against the money power. Keat had fought against Reconstruction, and he understood that redemption still loomed large in the state's politics, so he boldly attempted to shift the meaning of redemption's struggle from a conflict over race to one over class and section. Negro domination we hear so much about is a myth, he declared in 1894. In the worst days of radicalism, the Negroes did not control. The carpetbaggers dominated by Grant's bayonets dominated. In 1876, we assaulted their lines and drove them from the state. If the fight had always been a struggle among white men and even an enfranchised black majority could not dominate, then an opening might exist for a populist movement. But even this limited retreat from white supremacist orthodoxy was too much for Bowden, who sought to distance his paper from such sentiments. In the aftermath of the devastating 1892 defeat, Bowden offered an explicitly white supremacist rationale for allowing those who had supported populist presidential candidate James Weaver to continue to vote as Democrats in state elections. Haskellites, he pointed out, had continued to vote even after their apostasy, and South Carolina populists at least had not appealed to Cuffy to help them defeat the expressed will of the white people. Other more universalistic visions also ran up against the limits of white male producerism. Like many radical alliancemen, white A-Bill farmer Patrick Henry Adams had understood Ben Tillman's 1890 victory as the prelude to a greater contest against the money power. At an open meeting of his sub-alliance, Adams made a bold appeal to Tillman or anti-Tillmanite, Democratic or Republican or third-partyite, white or colored, suggesting that he was sympathetic to the possibility of a third party and interracial coalition. But Adams unwittingly expressed the white supremacy inherent in reform in the world Tillman had helped make. In Adams' analysis, the poverty of Southern farmers had begun with emancipation when they set about planting cotton because they had labor here trained in the cotton fields. His farmers, like Tillman's, were white land-owning employers. It did not occur to Adams that a majority of South Carolina's agricultural workers, colored, but by his own reckoning no less a part of the body politique, might regard themselves as farmers or understand post-emancipation agricultural economics rather differently. Adams also urged his audience to continue resisting the efforts of the Northern capitalists to crush us to death. Giving up that struggle, he explained, would not comport well with Southern manhood and Southern heroism. In the sectional context of his remarks, these phrases could only suggest arms-bearing white manhood. They would not have been understood to include black men whose sectional heroism had been almost universally in Northern blue. It certainly seems unlikely that he intended to refer to the black Union soldiers who had made their camps on Edgefield plantations in 1865. Assertive black manhood, far from being understood as Southern or heroic, appeared in white public discourse in the form of the black rapist, the antithesis of white manhood and the enemy of white womanhood. Although Adams' speech was free of overt racial antagonism when he sought a language of manly resistance adequate to the coming fight, he settled on the idiom of white manhood common to slaveholding, secession, war, and redemption. Struggling against these self-imposed limits, his envisioned crusade of our Southern farmers against the money power was doomed to failure. In winning their struggles from the mid-1870s to 1890, men like Tillman had fatally undermined the possibility of the development of a race-neutral language of manhood and citizenship. What remained was the language of the farmers, a language common to Democrats and populists, a language that implied whiteness and masculinity even as it laid claim to universality, a language in which only white men's collective struggle could bring political or economic redemption. This was not simply a discourse, but a powerful political and historical reality, one that overwhelmed the best intentions of those who sought to escape or defeat it. By late 1892, Tillman had done more than convince J. Hendricks McLean that the fight could not be won. He had left McLean without the words to understand his own defeat. For more than a decade, with indisputable courage, McLean had fought against democratic violence, fraud, and intimidation. Although he had spent time in Boston in self-imposed exile, he had continued to return to South Carolina to seek an alternative to the Democratic Party. As late as the spring of 1892, despite the terror he had encountered in the past, he continued to assert his right to speak publicly as a dissident in his native state, knowing that a man who sought the respect and votes of his fellow citizens could do no less. But McLean's tentative 1886 endorsement of Tillman foreshadowed the disheartening conclusion he reached by late 1892, although the former Greenbacker believed that black men's rights to vote and hold office would be essential to any agrarian coalition. He now conceded that any attempt to guarantee those rights would backfire. Federal legislative efforts to protect black voting rights, like black office holding, sustained the fear of Negro domination among Southern whites and helped to make the South more surely solid. For more than 10 years, McLean's political work had been based on the principle that this fear and the resulting solidity were anything but natural, but he was left unable to offer any solution at all. His vision of the political emancipation of both races would have to wait, he concluded, until Southern whites developed more kindly feelings and until the Negro was at peace with his white neighbor. McLean, reduced to analytically empty pleas for tolerance, gave up. He died in Boston in 1894, shortly before Ben Tillman began the first of his 4 terms in the U.S. Senate. Tillman's organization and leadership could not have succeeded without the cooperation of thousands of white voters who shared his concerns about the implications of populist radicalism and embraced his alternative, albeit almost purely rhetorical, vision of reform. Some Southern radicals may indeed have regarded Tillman, in the words of historian Lawrence Goodwin, as a transparent charlatan who was far more dedicated to the building of a personal political career than to leading a party revolution. But clearly many of the men those radicals sought as constituents did not agree. After living with slavery, secession, war, Reconstruction, paramilitary terror, and economic hardship, few white men could articulate a critique of the social order that did not prove vulnerable to co-optation by the state's reigning agrarian rebel, a man who successfully cast the populace as the latest incarnation of radical misrule, Bourbon incompetence, and Negro domination. To the extent that Tillman could pass himself off as an authentic representative of white farmers, it was because he understood these men's shared history and because he had helped shape it. Over the course of the 1890s, as populists throughout the South struggled vainly to create an alternative political culture in which black and white men could cooperate for mutual benefit, white Democrats mobilized white armies against them. But alongside those armies, they also mobilized a common understanding of white manhood, a language and history shaped by men like Ben Tillman. Even a victorious biracial populism might not have accomplished the radical transformation its proponents sought. Its programs might have failed to bring the relief they promised, and its coalition might have collapsed because of its own internal divisions. But this is not what happened in the 1880s and 1890s. Rather, during its short life, radical biracial agrarian politics struggled against both the long, deep history of racial hierarchy and the sharp, contemporary reality of democratic violence, fraud, and legal discrimination. That recent history was not contrary the predictions of James Henry Hammond and the claims of the Redshirts, virtually spontaneous. Certainly white supremacist assumptions and reactions arose unbidden from the minds and hearts of white men, but it took a good deal of strong, often coercive leadership to transform those reactions into collective actions, and still more of the same to sustain the project over time. Since Reconstruction, Ben Tillman more and more often had been one of the men providing that leadership, and by 1892 it appeared that he had won. The final victory over the populists, McLean's own transformation of his hard-fought defeat into a racially determined inevitability, marked yet another defining moment in the reconstruction of white supremacy. Chapter 5. The Mob and the State. In 1892, Governor Ben Tillman became nationally notorious for his lynching pledge. In cases where a black man was accused of raping a white woman, the governor said he would himself lead the lynch mob. But this promise, never kept, was not the whole story. In his 1890 inaugural address, Tillman had denounced the lynching of blacks as an infamous and deplorable crime, and both before and after his 1892 pledge, he backed up his words with state power. The governor corresponded at length with county sheriffs, called out the militia to safeguard prisoners, and demanded that citizens and officials uphold the majesty of the law. Tillman's foes, focusing on his advocacy of lynching and ignoring his opposition to it, denounced him as the mob law governor. But the contradictions revealed more than political expediency or shameful hypocrisy. In juxtaposing Tillman's support for the law with his support for lawlessness, his opponents struck closer to the mark than they understood, for Governor Tillman walked a tightrope between the mob and the state. Tillman's celebration of the violence at Hamburg and Ellington established his credentials as a militant white man. It also reinforced the notion that white men had the collective right to define justice and mete out punishment. In the antebellum era, white men had constituted the body of citizens who made up juries, patrols, and sheriff's posses. Even when they acted without formal legal sanction, they claimed the right of local enforcement in more or less formal terms. This was not the Beach Island planters of the 1840s and 1850s and the Minutemen of 1860 through 1861 had done. Later, the red shirts had claimed that kind of legitimacy even while attacking state-sponsored militia units. The red shirts' victory, however, neither returned black Southerners to slavery nor fully restored white men's monopoly on legitimate authority. In the post-emancipation South, even after 1876, extra-legal collective action was still essential. As red shirts, white caps, or lynchers, white men assaulted those who threatened white supremacist political, economic, or social strictures. Again, not all of the people they attacked were black. Through improper behavior, white men could lose their privileged position and become white Negroes, as vulnerable to violence as any antebellum traitor suspected of being a Yankee abolitionist. Tillman sustained this tradition of violence, but he understood its risks. At campaign meetings throughout the early 1890s, his political tactics encouraged disorderly behavior and brought white men to the verge of rioting against one another. Opponents charged him with being a demagogue, an anarchist, and they labeled his followers a mob. Yet as governor, particularly one whose claim to represent reform rested on state-level educational and regulatory programs, Tillman could not simply celebrate extra-legal violence. His lynching pledge was not the unreflective outburst of a radical redshirt, but a recognition of the importance many white men placed on the right to define and enforce local justice. It was an awkward and probably unworkable compromise between the tradition of white supremacist justice and the rule of law. Caught between the history of white men's local authority and the future he envisioned for state power, Tillman sought, rhetorically at least, both to legitimate these mobs and to control them through his leadership. In practice, of course, this could not work. No man, not even Ben Tillman, could credibly claim both to suppress mob violence and to be willing to lead a lynch mob. Tillman was not the only one facing this dilemma. The wealthy men who led the Tillmanite and anti-Tillmanite wings of the Democratic Party feared the consequences of unchecked vigilante violence. A climate of terror would drive black laborers from the state and disorganize the state's agricultural economy. Worse, from the perspective of those building mills and towns, South Carolina's reputation for violence would discourage investment and immigration. To these men, Tillman, the advocate of both mob violence and corporate regulation, appeared to stand squarely between South Carolina and the New South. Put simply, he injured the state's reputation as a field for investment. Yet some of these same men also understood and supported the principle of local authority and enforcement. When Tillman's effort to regulate the sale of alcohol seemed to infringe on their rights, they fought back with the same tactics of local collective defiance that in other contexts had seemed to constitute mob law. Tillman welcomed this resistance, for such conflicts enabled him to continue defining himself against powerful enemies. Although Tillman's new relationship to the powers of the state in some ways strained his identification with the farmers, as governor and head of a powerful legislative coalition, he was able to put the state to work, symbolically at least, against the farmers' enemies. Tillman presented his dispensary system, a state liquor monopoly, as a means of combating the forces that sought to undermine white men's households. His attempts to enforce the law provoked urban opponents to claim that he had overreached and become a tyrant, but Tillman demonstrated once again that he understood the power of martial mobilization to redefine a situation in his favor. In the end, he was able to use his official role to prove that his own forces were simply defending the victory of 1876 against white men who persistently, even perversely, misunderstood its meaning. The uses of a crowd. Tillman provoked conflicts in order to gain attention and rally supporters. Preparing for an 1887 public meeting, he urged a close ally to arrange a joint discussion with opponents in order to get a crowd. If you can have it understood that we are to divide time, he explained, you will get a crowd second only to 76. Indeed, at such joint stump appearances, speeches could become secondary. The meeting's real value to the candidate was the opportunity it presented to use his supporters' physical presence in multiple ways, to intimidate his opponents, to demonstrate his own capacity for aggression, and to create a sense of collective identity among his supporters that resembled the solidarity of men in combat. Not surprisingly, intra-party Democratic conflict soon began to resemble the inter-party conflict of 76. Provocative language from the speaker's platform encouraged verbal and physical aggression in the crowd below. Partisans attempted to drown out the opposition's speakers with hoots and derision, to howl them down. As supporters of rival factions confronted one another in the close confines of the meeting ground, tempers flared. Men fought with fists, sticks, and knives. They carried guns and sometimes drew them. Enemies complained that Tillman had created a white mob. The Edgefield Chronicle denounced his followers as a great crowd of men swept on by a spirit of enthusiasm bordering closely on blind fanaticism, constructed without mature deliberation upon a groundless fabric. Noise, turbulence, and threats of violence characterized the public meetings of the campaign, complained one anti-Tillmanite, and converted them into riotous assemblies where public issues could not be decently and gravely discussed, by which many of our best citizens were practically excluded. Tillman was responsible. When Tillmanites howled down Wade Hampton at an Aiken meeting, opponents blamed Tillman's leadership. A better class of leader, they claimed, would improve the climate for political debate. On occasions when such howling failed to silence anti-Tillmanite speakers, newspapers suggested that the commanding presence of a responsible Democratic leader had overawed the mob. The Charleston News and Courier lauded such victories of the irresistible power of intellectual manhood over brute force. It was indeed a sublime sight to see poor, miserable, illiterate, and misguided worshippers of the demagogue cowed into submissive silence. When an evil leader raised up a mob, it fell to the better class of men to subdue their chaotic assemblies. Whereas anti-Tillmanites described their leaders as exceptional individuals, Tillman identified himself with white voters and asserted their collective needs outweighed the reputation or honor of any individual. During the 1892 Democratic campaign, Tillman faced a nomination challenge from Edgefield lawyer, regional capitalist, and former governor John C. Shepherd. At one stump meeting, longtime Tillman opponent L.W. Yokemans spoke on Shepherd's behalf. When Tillman rose to reply, a fight among the factions in the audience seemed imminent. Tillman then left the speaker's stand, and Yeomans seized the opportunity to accuse Tillman of cowardice. In a letter to the public, however, an anonymous Tillmanite attempted to reframe this action as responsible leadership. Tillman's temper is none of the longest, the Tillmanite wrote, and possibly Yeoman's tirades may arouse the governor to resent them. Had Tillman responded to Yeoman's insults with the violence they merited, the result could have been a disastrous bloodbath among the white Democrats at the meeting. This established once again that Tillman was less concerned with his individual honor than with safeguarding the interests of his people, and the feelings of solidarity, the writer explained, were mutual. Many staunch, sturdy farmers were present, and they felt keenly all insults leveled at Tillman, feeling them to be insults to themselves, viewing Tillman as the representative of the poor but honest tillers of the soil. They would have left but little of Yeoman's had any trouble occurred. In this context, Tillman's sudden departure when things grew ugly indicated neither cowardice nor self-protection, but rather an effort to protect Yeoman's and white unity from Tillman's enraged supporters. By retreating, the writer claimed Tillman saved the life of L.W. Yeomans and probably many others. Manly restraint was, as always, only part of white male authority. On other occasions, Tillman seemed determined to keep men's bodies in violent motion as long as safely possible. During another 1892 confrontation between Tillman and Yeomans, this time in Edgefield, Tillman played the possibility of fratricidal violence among about 1,000 white Democrats for all it was worth. Jeering and heckling from Tillmanites interrupted Yeomans as he spoke, and when fights broke out in the crowd, Tillman declared that the meeting must be halted in order to prevent a serious riot from taking place. But this time, Tillman acknowledged the potential for mass violence in order to make direct use of it. He sought to prolong the confrontation, to take the crowd up to the edge of violence, demonstrating his identification with his farmers without quite provoking them to murder. This balancing act required a careful reading of the crowd. In this case, after having found it possible to make himself heard long enough to urge the meeting's suspension, Tillman instead called for a hand primary in which he asked men to raise their hands to show support for one candidate or another. Tillman only called for such a showing when he knew he had a majority on his side. These hand primaries had the effect of making his opponents appear marginal. After the hand primary, ostensibly in order to reduce tensions, Tillman and his supporters moved to a nearby building where the governor continued to speak. His opponents followed, however, and the shouting and fighting continued unabated. In fact, a reporter stated, perhaps overdramatically, that a pitched battle would have resulted if a single pistol had been drawn. The madness of the moment was infectious, declared the correspondent. solid, substantial citizens as well as the most fiery were thirsting for a fight, and it was a miracle that a regular battle was not fought. But if it was necessary for white men to demonstrate their capacity for violence, it was also essential that they understood its limits. With tensions so high that fratricidal violence among white Democrats seemed inevitable, Tillman once again urged his supporters to move away from their foes, this time to the courthouse. The governor's followers were swayed by his coolness and master will and immediately acted upon his suggestion. Carrying Tillman inside on their shoulders, reported the friendly local correspondent. In the courthouse, with his opponents excluded, he gave the speech that had been howled down outside. Such reports solidified Tillman's reputation as the true son of bloody Edgefield, a county long seen as particularly violent. Writing to an academic colleague, Robert Means Davis of South Carolina College acknowledged that Edgefield has enjoyed a very unenviable reputation for violence, but blamed that reputation on lurid reporting of the events of 1876. Tillman encouraged such coverage. If we over in Edgefield insult each other, he explained boastfully on another occasion, there is generally a fight or a funeral afterwards. This reputation was already well developed by the late 1880s. During a Tillman speech in Charleston, someone unexpectedly pounded a bass drum, causing an anxious crowd to flee in panic. When they returned, Tillman twitted them mercilessly. What were they running like turkeys for? Why, in his county, if there was to be a shooting, everybody would run to it. This appetite for violence was only half the story. In order to ensure that an actual riot among white men did not occur, Tillman and his rivals had to avoid losing control of themselves. If the political combat of the 1890s was full of rage, it was a rage well ordered. Despite his heated rhetoric, Tillman remained cool, alternately playing both the bully and the referee as the meeting developed, seeking to heighten partisan identification and an atmosphere of intimidation without quite calling for blood. To the courage, coolness, and magnificent self-control of Tillman is due the fact that the streets of Edgefield are not red tonight with the blood of her sons, declared a friendly newspaper. The capacity for violence had to be balanced by a capacity for restraint. Tillman, for all his apparent fire, could be cool enough to leave his opponents fuming. His 1894 campaign for the U.S. Senate set him against the incumbent Matthew Butler. The ex-Confederate general and red shirt leader believed he understood the tactics of 1876 as well as any man. In 1890, when Tillman was making his bid for the Democratic nomination for governor, Butler had predicted that Tillman's tactics would recoil on him. Invective and bluster availed its purpose to alarm Negroes, but it will not frighten white men. A few rowdies can make a great rumpus and noise, but they do not represent the body of the people. If anyone could neutralize Tillman, it would be Butler. And in the 1894 contest, he took the offensive, playing Tillman's game of accusation and slander, attempting to undermine Tillman's claim to leadership. Butler presented affidavits from participants stating that when the shooting had started at Hamburg, Tillman was not to be found. Tillman rebutted the accusation with the reports of his own witnesses and claimed accurately enough that Butler had downplayed his role in the violence in his congressional testimony. but Tillman scored his real points against Butler by understanding the difference between public expressions and personal feelings. He emphasized his commitment to white unity, claiming that he had borne Butler's attacks because, as governor of the state, he could not afford to create a row at a public gathering and have our people murder each other like dogs. Unable to compete with Tillman in rallying partisans at stump meetings, Butler retreated from the ground rules of 1876, declaring that it was not Christian civilization to howl anyone down. He recanted his espousal of that practice. He was charged with teaching it in 1876. It was wrong, and he prayed to change it now. After he failed to best Tillman in the arena of popular white supremacist politics, Butler sought to move the conflict back to the more personal ground of the Code of Honor. After one campaign meeting, he accosted Tillman in his railroad car, called him a liar, and attempted to strike him. But Tillman understood that to establish a claim to leadership in the new era, it was more important to prove one's commitment to collective action than to take part in personal combat. He had no intention of confronting Butler with anything but words. Sally Tillman, reading reports of Butler's advances, wrote worriedly to her husband. "You must not fret and worry about me," Tillman replied. "I pray you have no fear for my safety. I shall ignore Butler from this on and give no excuse for any more dangerous or exciting scenes." He assured her that his friends at the meetings would warn him of any impending assault and that he himself would remain cool and watchful. The context of lynching. Tillman and Butler were in close agreement on at least one thing, however. Neither man suggested that there had been anything wrong with howling down black Republicans. In fact, their struggle over the legacy of 1876 was in part over who could more legitimately claim to have murdered them. By the 1890s, lethal and non-lethal vigilante violence against African Americans had become a regular feature of Southern life. The causes ranged from violations of political or economic hierarchies to social or sexual transgressions. Bands of armed white men broke up Republican and independent political meetings, and black laborers' organizations and groups known as Whitecaps policed interracial, social, and sexual boundaries. In May 1891, a couple from Kansas, a white man and a black woman, whom the paper identified as his alleged wife, were roused from their bed and whipped by Whitecaps. A few months later, a mob of disguised men destroyed the property of a black man and white woman whom they accused of improperly living together. Edgefield's Whitecaps made it a custom to take out and severely whip disreputable Negro women. Disreputable, unsurprisingly, covered a wide array of activities, ranging from the consensual to the commercial. Tillman recognized the existence of a biracial world of sociability and sexuality. However, he believed that consensual interracial liaisons should be downplayed as much as possible. After investigating one case of a disorderly house to which black men came for criminal intercourse with white women, a local official wrote to Tillman acceding to the governor's request that the official reports be suppressed. The affair is too smutty for publication or of interest to the decent public, he agreed. Whitecaps, like other groups of vigilantes, included men from the topmost social strata. In the case of the disorderly house, the official explained that the better class of white people took steps to run the Negro off and break up the nest. Similarly, when black Edgefieldians resisted Whitecap attacks, it became obvious that vigilante action had elite sponsors. One night in June 1892, when a white Edgefield man named John Paul mounted the porch of a black man's home and identified himself by name, the people inside shot and killed him. They had prepared to defend themselves against such depredations and thought that they were being attacked by the members of the White Cap organization, a newspaper explained. That is, they knew Paul by name, believed him to be a white cap, and shot him. Paul was buried by his comrades of the Edgefield Rifles, a former red shirt unit now integrated into the state militia. Whether the Whitecaps were a subdivision of the Rifles or had overlapping membership, it is evident that white terror involved white men well outside the putatively degraded mob element. During the 1890s, white men more and more often justified their acts of terror by portraying them as efforts to protect white womanhood and, by extension, the white patriarchal household. White women's sexuality became a crucial defensive perimeter for white supremacy. If black men and white women married or had children together, more than white men's primacy of sexual access to women would be challenged. Whiteness itself would be undermined, and since few white men would admit that any respectable white woman would voluntarily participate in what they called mongrelization, they saw such interracial liaisons as necessarily forced. The black beast rapist, perpetrating what newspapers and politicians called outrageous assaults or simply outrages, emerged as the prime embodiment of the forces threatening white households. White women's sexuality became an arena not unlike political or economic relations in which some men sought dominance over others. Murderous spectacles not only terrorized black citizens but also reaffirmed white men's authority over their women, their communities, and the law itself. In one case, after 3 black South Carolina men were accused of raping a white woman, the lynch mob gave special consideration to the feeling of the injured husband. After the 3rd accused man was captured, the sheriff waited for the husband's consent before turning the captive over to the mob. With the husband's cooperation, the lynchers tortured the 3 men before hanging them and repeatedly shooting their dead bodies. As lynchings increased during the 1890s, activists such as Ida B. Wells Barnett pointed out that only 1/3 of all lynchings were even purportedly in retaliation for acts of rape or attempted rape. She and other critics saw economic conflict as the cause of most lynching and interpreted references to outrageous assaults and brutes in human form as cynical ploys. Their critique was a well-taken corrective to the mythology of the day, but in focusing on the contradictions and hypocrisies surrounding lynching, it did not fully explain the context and meaning of white supremacist violence. First, sexual and economic life were not as readily divorced as Victorian proprieties and analysis of lynching's causes normally demanded. The separation of public and private spheres, like white supremacy itself, was a social argument, not a social fact. It could therefore be contested and defeated. Many whites accepted the argument that black people's movement into workplaces, political arenas, and public accommodations would logically lead to the social equality white supremacists dreaded. Second, the post-Reconstruction Southern economy worked to increase white paranoia about black men's sexual predation of white women and girls, as black men seeking work moved across the South in ever-increasing numbers, and the local and personal patron-client relationships born in slavery grew weaker. Each black stranger moving through the new social and economic landscape became a potential rapist in the eyes of suspicious whites. Simultaneously, many Southern newspapers obsessively repeated reports of rapes and lynchings from all over the region, creating a kind of journalistic feedback loop that distorted social reality. Lynchings that followed rape-related accusations were more likely to draw large carnival-style crowds. Crimes allegedly committed by black men against white women, chiefly rape and attempted rape, were held up as justification for nearly half of all lynchings over most of South Carolina between 1881 and 1895. In sum, a highly disproportionate number of lynchings that white Southerners read about, observed, or participated in followed allegations of rape or attempted rape. Many white men could therefore see lynching as a collective struggle in defense of the sole economic and social resource that most shared. The sun-browned goddess, in Tillman's terms, whose productive and reproductive labor made a farm into a household. Even if lynching made white men into a mob, it was a label some were prepared to embrace. As historian Drew Gilpin-Faust has noted, killing is honorable under some circumstances, indictable under others. Just as Tillman's murderous activities in the mid-1870s had been transformed into acts of political courage, many murders in post-Reconstruction South Carolina were transformed into honorable deeds through the substitution of white supremacist justice for the rule of law. As a result, Democratic officials had difficulty preventing or prosecuting lynching. In the last days before Tillman took power in 1890, the Richland County Sheriff wrote to Governor John P. Richardson to ask that a prisoner be moved to the state penitentiary before a lynch mob could organize. Otherwise, the sheriff anticipated that he would be placed in a position of being forced to fire on my friends. The governor assented. Richardson frequently corresponded with solicitors and sheriffs regarding potential lynchings, and he offered rewards for the capture of lynchers. He occasionally called out the militia to prevent assaults on prisoners. But lynchings continued and went unpunished during his tenure. In communities where lynchings occurred, coroners' juries routinely found that victims had been killed at the hands of parties unknown. Even papers opposed to lynching, such as the Edgefield Chronicle, claimed a suspicious degree of ignorance as to the composition of local lynch mobs. Just as Tillman became governor in late 1890, the number of lynchings and the attention paid to them increased dramatically. Mobs more and more frequently preempted the work of civil authorities, often explicitly claiming the authority of white supremacist higher law. In 1889 and 1890, mobs lynched a total of 17 South Carolinians. Of 170 lynchings committed in South Carolina in the 6 decades between 1881 and 1940, nearly a third took place during the 1890s. And during that decade, lynchings in upcountry Edgefield, Abbeville, Lawrence, and Newberry counties actually outnumbered legal executions. As part of a local and regional pattern, lynching cut too close to the heart of white men's expectations and fears for Tillman to ignore it. But now that Tillman was governor, the law might require him to use the militia to prevent lynchings. The former red shirt faced the mob as head of state. Fighting the mob, leading the mob. At first, Tillman presented himself as an outright foe of lynching. The Shell Manifesto's litany of grievances against the Redeemer government had included a complaint about the continued resurgence of horrible lynchings which reformers claimed resulted from bad laws and their inefficient administration. A few months later, an Edgefield grand jury on which Ben Tillman sat blamed lynching on an inefficient and overly lenient Supreme Court. In his inaugural address, Tillman condemned lynching explicitly and at length. With all the machinery of the law in our hands, he lectured, it is simply infamous that resort should be had to lynch law and that prisoners should be murdered because the people have grown weary of the law's delay and its inefficient administration. Negroes have nearly always been the victims, and the confession is a blot on our civilization. Let us see to it that the finger of scorn no longer be pointed at our state because of this deplorable condition of affairs. Let punishment for a crime be prompt and sure, and with the removal of the cause the effect will disappear. His inaugural condemnation of lynching concluded with a pious avowal that every Carolinian worthy the name must long to see the time when law shall reassert its sway. As governor, though, Tillman found himself in the difficult position of representing both the rule of law and the reconstruction of white supremacy. Tillman had become governor in order to use state power, not to defy it, and a state that could foster agricultural renewal, regulate industry, and defend white men from federal and corporate depredations had to be able to enforce its own laws. But white men's collective action, including violence, had been and continued to be central to his vision of renewal. From 1876 to 1890, such action made his project possible. The clash cut deep. Unlike many of his opponents, who could claim to have been voices for peace, conciliation, and compromise, Tillman risked diluting his appeal if he subordinated the will of the white people to the rule of law. He had to continue to wage a struggle against powerful opponents or risk losing his status as an iconoclast champion of the weak. But he also needed to appear to be protecting black South Carolinians against extra-legal violence. Shortly after his election, Tillman's secretary conveyed Tillman's views to a black Georgetown resident. While white supremacy is best for both races, he believed that the colored people should have the protection of the laws as fully as other citizens. In 1891, he warned a Goldville man who had led a crowd in assaulting a black man that you will certainly be prosecuted if it is not stopped at once. On a more practical level, agricultural employers like Tillman understood that when a climate of terror drove away black Carolinians, it also drove up the price of labor. During a wave of politically inspired violence in 1895, a planter urged Tillman's successor, John Gary Evans, to restrain local vigilantes. My farmhands have been driven from plantation by whitecaps. Am ruined if my hands don't return. I ask for their protection and beg your help. For over a year, despite these tensions, Ben Tillman continued to oppose lynching and other extra-legal violence as attacks on the reputation of the state and the rule of law. In his official letterbooks, he applauded a local sheriff for safeguarding a threatened prisoner and declared that if all of our peace officers shall act as promptly and decisively, our state will be spared the disgrace of any more lynchings. He corresponded with sheriffs throughout the state, giving and receiving warnings of impending lynchings and ordering investigations when they occurred. He frequently called out local militia units to prevent lynchings. In a lecture to the sheriff of Spartanburg, he displayed his attention to the details of the state's duty to protect its prisoners. It had just as well be understood that the law in South Carolina must be respected and that lynch law will not be tolerated, he wrote. You will therefore return to Spartanburg tonight and summons a posse of brave and trusty deputies to be in readiness by Thursday. The prisoner will be sent back to Spartanburg that day. The Morgan Rifles will meet train bearing him at Clifton and escort the prisoner to the jail, after which I shall rely on you and your posse to uphold the majesty of the law and protect the jail against the riot if any assembles. You can, if you deem it necessary at any time, summon the Morgan Rifles to your assistance, but I rely upon your own loyalty and that of your posse to show that Spartanburg's citizens know their duty and will do it. This commitment seemed to bear fruit. In his first annual address to the legislature in November 1891, Tillman could boast that during the year the law in the state has been supreme and no person or prisoner has been lynched. Tillman even asked for the authority to remove sheriffs who did not fulfill their responsibilities, even though this would mean unseating locally elected officials. He justified this unmistakable endorsement of state interference in local affairs, a last desperate remedy to be used only when others failed, by describing it as a necessary compromise between state and local power. He approached the subject gingerly, acknowledging the danger of this sort of executive authority. The Anglo-Saxon race has never been jealous of the prerogatives of the king. Their descendants in America are equally watchful against official tyranny, but it is easy to show that there is no possibility of the executive having the laws faithfully executed unless his hands are strengthened. A few days after Tillman delivered his 1891 address, however, a black Edgefield man named Dick Lundy was lynched after being charged with murdering the sheriff's son. Tillman immediately alerted the state solicitor, ordering him to go to Edgefield to investigate whether the sheriff had acted appropriately and to see that the majesty of the law is vindicated. Tillman subsequently held a crafty leader responsible, but he also charged local officials with complicity in the lynching. He ridiculed the finding that parties unknown had committed the murder, blamed his friend the sheriff for allowing personal tragedy to interfere with upholding the law, and declared that the law received a wound for every bullet shot into Dick Lundy's body. Hostile commentators thought the lynching, not the rebuke, represented Tillman's true nature. The Charleston News and Courier blamed the lawless spirit which prevails among the people of Edgefield County. The paper questioned his ability to stop the mob and suggested that he had been present. With true Edgefield instinct, Tillman would probably have been hanging around on the edge of the mob, neither a law-abiding man nor a bold lyncher. Even after Lundy's murder, though the newspaper praised Tillman for the low incidence of lynching since his inauguration, as well as for his public opposition to lynching, it is to the credit of Governor Tillman that he has lent the whole influence and power of his office to prevent and to discourage such affairs, admitted the normally hostile Daily, a mass meeting of black activists protesting the second lynching that occurred during Tillman's administration, concurred, commending Tillman for his efforts to prevent lynchings in the state. Tillman sought to uphold the law, but he believed the black criminality posed a danger to white society, and he understood the value that white men attached to defending their personal and local prerogatives. As lynchings increased in number and ferocity, he saw his twin commitments to white supremacy and the rule of law come into murderous conflict. At first, he sought to give the law priority. Tillman, his secretary, wrote to a constituent, was in sympathy with and will maintain white supremacy and will enforce the law in that direction, but at the same time, justice must not be overridden. But Tillman needed both sets of credentials to carry out his programs, and the conflict was not so easily finessed. Tillman attempted to reconcile the rule of law and white supremacist justice by claiming leadership within both systems. At an 1892 stump meeting, he declared that although he opposed lynching, he would himself willingly lead a mob in lynching a Negro who had committed an assault upon a white woman. The authority of his position would render the lynching quasi-official. At the same time, his pledge to lead the mob re-established him as the arbiter of white supremacist justice, limiting such legitimation to cases of rape or attempted rape. Tillman was able violently to defend white supremacy, but without appearing indiscriminately bloodthirsty. The tactic seemed to meet with his supporters' approval, and at an A-Bill campaign meeting later that summer, supporters presented Tillman with a banner hailing him as the champion of white men's rule and women's virtue.
Context of White Supremacy. That is where we will pick up for the second audio segment. Feel free, chime in if you would like to participate. The number to dial is 760-569-7676. The code is 564-943 pound. Press star 6 if you would like to participate. If you do not want to use the phone to dial in, you can use the free Flash phone. It works anywhere in the world. Again, it's free. It's linked at the Black Talk Radio Network. If you need the address, it is tiny, TINY.cc/1race. And that is the number 1. So the address one more time, tiny, TINY.cc/1race. And that is the number 1. Once you put that in, click the link on the left side of the page. It says free Flash phone. Once you click it, it'll open a small window on your screen. The top line is a drop-down menu. That number is 760-569-7676. That's the number you're going to select from the drop-down menu. The next line, it's going to ask for the code. That code again, 564-943. Final line, it'll ask for a name. You can put in a real name, nickname, click random keys, whatever. Once you get all that information entered, click the green button at the bottom. It will connect you to the program. You should be able to hear us live. It's the same procedure if you would like to participate. You'll see a dial pad on your screen. Press star 6. You will hear an audio prompt. Press the number 1. I'll see your hand. We'll get you on the line and you will be able to share. Let me know if you got confused, need any help dialing in to participate. Again, we'll be picking up second audio segment on page 169, first paragraph 169. That's where we will pick up at. Looking forward to hearing any thoughts, observations. Let's see. Mr. Dimray 4 should be with us. I will nab other hands as I see them. Good to hear from you, Mr. Dimray 4.
Yes, can I be heard?
Yes, sir.
Okay, greetings, Gus. Greetings to the other phone and listening. You know, I was fascinated with the word populist and Bill Tillman's opposition to populism. But then Tom Watson was supposed to exemplify that populist idea. And last week, you gave us a look into the real mind of Tom Watson, whereas he was pretending to be on the side of, a coalition between black Republicans and the like. But in actuality, he was just a racist in hiding. It had been years of crop failure, the falling prices, produce, poor marketing, a lack of credit for the poor farmers. So the populist movement philosophy was appealing to the poor people who were struggling against the white elite. So this guy, Tom Watson, whose statue is across the street from the Georgia Capitol, posing as a liberal, sought the black vote in order to win office. And then he championed the need for poor farmers and sharecroppers of both races. He spoke against lynching and all this. But during the 1908 presidential bid, he ran as the white supremacist that he really was, using his newspaper and his magazine against black, Catholic, and Jews. And we know that during that time that, the way his newspaper was reporting, it was instrumental in Leo Frank's lynching, which Leo Frank was a Jewish American, I guess, or whatever. He got caught up, and they gave him the old lynch party. Okay, what stands out to me mostly is overwhelming agreement of white supremacy among all the whites, no matter what class or political belief. On page 152, when the colonel and his son, Joseph Keith, along with J.W. Bolton, they were going to get together and, form this. They were activists, going to form a new party, right? And they talked about Negro domination, about the myth of it, and that if the fight had always been a struggle among white men, and even an enfranchised black majority could not dominate, then that was an opening for a populist movement. So this guy, J.W. Bolton, he was in agreement of that until, they got to the part that, he offered an explicit white supremacist rationale for allowing those who had supported the populist presidential candidate, James Weaver, to continue to vote as Democrats in state elections. He didn't want his paper to be associated with anything that had anything to do with trying to help blacks. And when we get to chapter 5, they just go all out because we have a mob mentality. You got the red shirts, the white caps, lynchers, and the governor's pledge to lead the lynch mob of any black person that's accused of raping a white woman. And I thought it was interesting that when they made this statement, they said accused, even accused of raping a white woman. And then later on the book, he said they mentioned that if he had, been found guilty of that, so it's a play on words. But we all know that that's a common denominator when it comes to so-called lynching blacks. They use that excuse regularly. And on page 156, even when they acted without formal legal sanction, their improper behavior, white men could lose their position and be looked upon as white Negro. By them instituting that, they could control, it was serious circumstances for any white person that was known to be associating with or helping any black people or black Republican at the time. It's a lot here, but I thought that in 162, when they talked about the band of white men, bands of armed white men broke up Republican and independent political meetings, and black laborers, organizations and groups known as white caps, policed interracial, social, and sexual boundaries. It's this mob mentality, and they're just going overboard, and it looks as though Bill Tillman is like the godfather in this mob situation. But like this saying goes, the black domination reigns over us like the sword of Damocles. I'll read my line.
Man, I shared that with folks throughout the week, and again, I think everyone said, "What's the sword of Damocles?" Man. Oh well. If other folks have input, feel free. Appreciate it, Mr. Demery. I thought there were quite a few interesting tidbits throughout. Even you reminding us of I guess the book brought him up this week as well. Tom Watson. They mentioned him last week as well. Georgia, so-called populist and racist, admitted. That, in my opinion, would be an astronomical act of racism on the part of the author. That's something I've been saying the whole time. I said it again today. To be on the alert. The author of this book is a white man. So, you should be thinking that, okay, a racist wrote this book. That should be expressed in some way, shape, or form. I am not a historian. I do have a degree in history, but I'm not a historian. Professor Kantrowitz, in addition to being white and likely a white supremacist, he is a professor. He has had a lot more training, a lot more studying. I'm sure he's read a lot more. He has access to a lot more information. I'm pretty sure that he knows the evolution of Tom Watson's career. The fact that that was not included in this book, and that he gets presented, because that's something I talk about all the time, that the importance, the significance of the idea, this mythology of good white people that are not racist. And I know this book is specifically focused on Ben Tillman and South Carolina, and I mean really narrowly focused on not just South Carolina, but I mean Ben Tillman and his experience in a brief period in South Carolina. But I mean, you have brought up Tom Watson. He's not just, a one-time reference. You talk about him, you kind of compare him. He's having these debates with Ben Tillman. I would submit that that is a major act of racism, white supremacy, to leave that information out. I'll leave that for folks to ponder. And Professor Kantrowitz, I don't know if I said it last week, but he did email me last week, and he sent me one of his latest reports on Ben Tillman. And he is aware that we are doing this study session. I think I had said before we started this that I had been in contact with him and hoped to have him on the program. He was agreeable, but he said he was traveling out of the country for some time this summer, and that he would be down to schedule something once he gets back in the States. So, if we can make that happen, that is on the itinerary to ask him about, that portion of the text. Let's see. Let me get some of my other tidbits here. Let's see. Wait a minute, before I even get to some of my notes, just looking at the section Mr. Demery was talking about, J.W. Bowden, importance of journalism. I don't know how many times I've said that, but a lot of the information that's in the text, it comes from old newspaper clippings and what have you. Just important to say that all the time, reading the paper, not just the paper from today, but sometimes even papers from 100 years ago can have very important information. But importance of journalism, Ida B. Wells Barnett was mentioned as well, black journalists. But on page 153, I think we talked about this last week, the section, it says, where they were talking about Bowden, where Mr. Demery where he said Mr. Bowden, he didn't want to be mistaken or have anyone get the impression that he was somehow trying to help Negroes. And so he said that he pointed out that he was okay with these populists being able to continue voting. Like, he didn't think that these white people should be punished for voting in the Populist Party. And he explained this because he said at least they hadn't appealed to Cuffy to help them defeat the expressed will of the white people. And again, this is sentences like these. That's one of the reasons that I appreciate a text like this, even though I know it's dry. And I mean, it's a beautiful day in Seattle. We could all be doing better things. But that's one of the reasons that I appreciate a text like this. Is because it's not diluted. I mean, you just get it straight. This is what it is to hear white people talking explicitly about their dedication to the religion of white supremacy. But just, we talked about that label of calling black people Cuffy, and how common that is. You'll see that a lot in literature and language, particularly this time period, 19th century. You'll see a lot of that. And I think we talked even last week something about the etymology and the symbolism of that. Sounding like cuffing, handcuffing, shackling someone, that's the way that whites are trained to think of, perceive black people. And I think you hear a lot, or at least I've heard a lot of that in the text this week. Okay, moving to some of the things that I actually wrote out on 154. Again, speaking of the explicit nature of the text, where they say that Tillman, men like Tillman, had fatally undermined the possibility of the development of a race-neutral language on manhood and citizenship. Again, blatant. Make it explicit. It's impossible to say that you don't know, you're ignorant about racism, I'm not informed. No. That is not possible. If you are a white person, you are expected, it is demanded that you be an active participant in the system of white terrorism. That's why I say all the time when these white people are talking about, they get the benefits, no. that's it is not exclusive to that. Those benefits are derived from abusing, pillaging, raping non-white people, especially black people. Very important section of text, I thought. On 162, I think the Godfather was mentioned. Okay, 162, where Tillman, he says, but Tillman scored his real points against Butler by understanding the difference between public expressions and personal feelings. He emphasized his commitment to white unity, claiming that he had borne Butler's attacks because, as governor of the state, he could not afford to create a row at a public gathering and have our people murder each other like dogs. very important section, I think, as well. I feel like I heard Mr. Fuller in there when he quotes from The Godfather. It's not personal. It's just business. Like, the way that you go about things. And I mean, to me, that's just racist code right there. That to be a more refined, a more effective white terrorist, I can't take it personal and be getting into disputes and what have you with other white people. I'll use that to my advantage personally, all in the interest of the system of white supremacy and me personally. But I just can't be getting myself emotionally out of control about what another white person says. And I mean, you've heard earlier in the book, right, that there have been so many examples. We talked about it before. They're dueling and brawling. You got some of that this week too. But over just, you said something about my wife, or you said something about me, or, whatever. Name calling is grounds for death. But him saying, hey, that's not the most efficient way to maintain white supremacy. We can do this stuff, we can get into these little verbal jousts for political display and performance to the degree that it will benefit me. But all of this must be, as he said, within restraint. Very important section, I thought, and something that definitely can and should be applied to our efforts at counter racism, not taking things personal, even not taking, things personal from other people on our side of the chessboard, other non-white people, not taking it personal there when we have disagreements and what have you, that, we're all just trying to solve the problem, advance the business of counter racism. On 163, man, I thought this was so important. On 163, where he says, when Mr. Demery had already mentioned the White Caps, this group of white ruffians who went out, terrorists, abusing, committing violence against black people, where it says that these white terrorists, like other groups of vigilantes, included men from the topmost social strata. In the case of the disorderly house, the official explained that the better class of white people took steps to run the Negro off and break up the nest. Man, that metaphors, I say that right there. Metaphors comparing black people to some sort of insect or bee or wasp or something of that nature, a pest. But that portion right there, how many times have we heard these tacky, trifling racists come on this program, and some victims, unfortunately, because white people are very effective, but say that, racism, that, elite white people or very powerful white people, that they have duped poor white people, low-class white people, uninformed white people. They have duped them into practicing racism, but it's really all just a benefit. How many times have we heard that? I know I've heard it. I can't even count, man. This, in my opinion, total lie. These folks are out there leading the mob. Now, I guess you could take the position to say, well, that's a part of the ruse. I don't think so. In my opinion, these folks are just as racist as everybody else. I think, as Mr. Demery said, I think even as the book points out, you have pretty much unanimity on one thing with the white race. We are supposed to terrorize and dominate everybody who is not white. Total agreement. Let's just get about the business of doing that. Now, we can disagree and fight, stomp, and curse, kill each other all we want, but hey, we are all in this about the business of stomping on black people. Yes, total go there all day, every day, worldwide. But I thought that was really important, and that was emphasized repeatedly, that this is not just something where it's poor white people, these mobs that are going around doing, because I hear that frequently, and I think even in Cameron McWhirter's book, Red Summer, where he talks about the white terrorism of 1919, it's the same thing where you got the governor coming out to lead some of these mobs to go out and lynch a black person, and Ben Tillman bragging about doing this and having done so years before he became governor and senator and all that other stuff. But I just thought that was really significant to give some pushback and to have a hard piece of evidence you can go to. There are others as well to rebuff these claims that, it's these rich white people are just confusing and controlling poor, ignorant, dumb white people and getting them to practice racism for the elite ruling class of white people, this small little group here. One more point I'll get out, and then we'll get to some of the folks that called in. 165, where he says, he's talking about the lynch. This whole section on lynchings is fascinating for many reasons, if folks have any commentary there. But he says, he's talking about Tillman. Tillman occasionally called out the militia to prevent assaults on prisoners, but lynchings continued and went unpunished during his tenure. In communities where lynchings occurred, coroners' juries routinely found that victims had been killed at the hands of parties unknown. Even papers opposed to lynching, such as the Edgefield Chronicle, claimed a suspicious degree of ignorance as to the composition of local lynch mobs. You'll hear this again as this chapter goes on, but talk about another pattern, this suspicious ignorance on the part of white people. It is total malarkey. I'm sure some of these folks had subscriptions to these newspaper, worked for the newspaper, went to church with them. Like, oh yes, Bob and Ted and Mary and Jane, they were all out. But yet we don't, just parties unknown. And I'm sure this was a pattern. This was not just an Edgefield thing or a South Carolina thing. This was a broad pattern of white people asserting that they just didn't know what happened to these niggers. The person who dialed in, last 4-digit, caller in Florida. Did you have commentary, thoughts you wanted to share?
Yes, greetings, Gus, and everybody else. Just about the only thing I can say is white people have a code. They have a code. And just like I've been hearing you say, that it doesn't matter on the different income levels or educational levels. It's a basic that they have in common, that they are going to mistreat and or subjugate non-white people, especially non-white people who they racially classify as being black. And this book describes this on a continuous basis. Every reading portion that you do, that's what it describes to me. I haven't been able to follow it deep, but while I'm doing some other things, that is what I get out of it. Each reading, the person that is the central person, he is more or less on the academic level, intellectual level of how to be a terrorist, of being a terrorist. And unfortunately, in my opinion, non-white people don't understand the level to this very organized level of mistreatment that we are being beaten up on by. And therefore, we make a lot of mistakes on our part because we don't collectively have a code like white people have a code. Do they argue with one another? Yes. Do they even dislike one another at some points in time, or a lot of points? Yes. But they're not going to argue about whether or not they're going to mistreat non-white black people. It's just a question of how it's going to be done, what methods are going to be put in place in order to make that common denominator happen. And that's my take for right now.
Caller at 5234, you should be with us. Appreciate hearing that retired firefighter in Florida. 5234, did you have commentary?
Yes. Can I be heard?
Yes, sir.
All right. Greetings, Gus. And I missed the earlier part of the reading because I was actually in the middle of traveling. But I caught a portion that just brought something that stood out to me when Ben Tillman was running for governor, and he was trying to convince people that he was an opponent of lynching, when his history of terrorizing black people was well known, and he was already quite highly celebrated, which is probably how he made it to where he got in the first place. And just the whole idea of deception. I mean, it's like that section of the book was like reading, Machiavelli or The Art of War or, the Book of the Five Rings by Musashi. I mean, just the whole idea of deception and how it plays out in our everyday existence. But, they hide everything in plain sight. And to me, that's a prime example of how to use deception to your advantage. And that's something that we really have to take into account. I mean, and that's for all white people, females especially. We have to start taking that into account, that they are deceptive. So just because they're nice to you or they do something for you or they give you some money to help you out doesn't mean a damn thing. They are actively busy while they're helping you out, working on your destruction at the same time. And if we can actually keep that in the forefront of our minds whenever we see them, whenever they're in our presence, whenever, anything to do with them, just keep deception at the forefront of your mind. And I'll mute my line. Thank you.
Right on. Anybody, any of the other folks who are listening, if you have thoughts you would like to share, we have about a little more than 15 minutes before we get to the second audio segment. So if you have something you want to share, go ahead, get your hand up. If you think you want to participate. I was going to ask as well. I think that was significant because he has and as the caller said, I think the book lays out that that is exactly how he came to be governor in South Carolina, bragging about his participation in the Hamburg massacre, and then even continuing to brag that he would lead a lynch mob to get a Negra if one had been accused of an outrage against a white woman. So that was a huge part, really the core part of how he became governor, senator, and everything else. I assert that's the core reason that his statues and shrines and everything else is still there. That's why it's Tillman Hall to this day. But I also think it is significant in terms of that, I don't even know what you want to call it, hypocrisy, we'll say. This hypocrisy around him saying, well, this is my whole career, bragging, boasting about participating in torturing, terrorizing black people. Now I'm going to be governor and give my inaugural address and say that, this is deplorable and we shouldn't do this. Now that I'm supposed to be governor, and almost like, this is supposed to be, I'm in charge. You all are challenging me for authority. Does that make sense, or how do you all interpret this? Because I'm certainly not reading it as I am against this or I think this is incorrect. If I was reading why he was saying this, it would just be how we're going to allocate power within the system of white supremacy. I'm governor now, so I'm supposed to be. And I also think it's crucial. I want to finish that point, but I also think it's crucial. The Civil War is not that far behind, so they do not want federal intrusion if things really get out of hand. I think that's super, super important, but I think that also ties into I'm governor now. I'm supposed to be in charge, major position of power within the state of South Carolina. In terms of how we go about doing business, people going out, having white gangs going out and terrorizing and doing this mob activity. Even though I'm not, supporting Negroes or whatever, I'm totally for that, would do it myself. But this is upsetting the balance of power within the system of white supremacy, even my power as governor and a white man within the system of white supremacy. Does that make sense? Or how are you all reading this hypocrisy around his participation in lynchings, and then him saying that this is bad and we shouldn't be doing this?
Can I be heard?
Yes, sir.
I completely concur with what you just said. And the reason why is because actually right now I'm reading a book that discusses Ben Tillman quite a bit, and Edgefield and South Carolina as a state. It's called All God's Children by Fox Butterfield. And in the book, they discuss the fact that Edgefield and South Carolina in particular was literally the murder capital of the entire country. They discuss, and that's why I think when you talk about having the federal government get involved, because of the legend of the state of South Carolina as far as its violence and the whole dueling, when you're discussing dueling, in that book they really discuss the details of dueling, the fact that Ben Tillman's brother George was a dueler and killed a couple of people himself. So I think you're absolutely right as far as the atmosphere of violence and the reputation of South Carolina, that if he did not speak to it in that manner, and they did not codify their reaction. So in other words, it's almost like when he was talking, he would basically let them know, hey, I'm always on your side. We just have to do this a little differently now that I'm in this kind of a situation. And collectively, they seem to respond to that. So what you said makes 100% sense, especially now that I'm reading this other book, and it's kind of bringing more of his family history and the understanding of the history of South Carolina. It all falls right in here. Thank you.
Can it be heard?
Yes, sir.
I'm gonna have to go back and listen to the show, obviously, again. But I really couldn't get what the brother was just said. He might be too close to the phone, maybe. It was like muffled and distorted at the same time. So I missed it. I know I missed out a lot of information. So I'm gonna just mute my line and.
Was it just the previous caller, or has it been?
Yeah, just the previous caller.
Okay.
Just came on. I don't know. Was he muffled to you? But maybe it's just me.
I heard him crystal clear where he was saying.
I just got to go back and listen again. Then it must be just me because he was really muffled, man. It was like he was talking.
Huh.
So I don't know. I'll try and listen again when it's posted and because I'm gonna listen to it anyway. So. All right, so I'm listening to it over again. So, all right, but I just thought I'd just tell the brother that I couldn't hear him. I'm not sure if anybody else could. So, sorry about that. I'm my line right now.
The other people, did you all understand what the previous caller said?
I could hear him, but I understood it.
Okay. Yeah, I understood it. All God's Children, the book that he's reading about South Carolina, Edgefield, murder capital of the country. Yeah, I thought it was crystal clear. But okay. Anybody else had any thoughts on that? I was also going to ask the significance of why the terrorist mob that went by the name of the Whitecaps. What do you all think is the significance of that name for the group? Any thoughts on that as well, or anything else folks want to bring up? But I did want to get that out as well.
Yes, those Edgefield Whitecaps made it a custom to take out and severely whip disrespectful Negro women. Come on. I mean, these gangs of whites are just, out of control. But on page 163, at the bottom it says, white women's sexuality became a crucial defensive parameter for white supremacy. If black men and white women married and had children together, more than a white man's primacy of sexual access to women would be challenged. Whiteness itself would be undermined, and since few white men would admit that any respectable white woman would voluntarily participate in what they call mongrelization. See, that's the basis of it right there, of this mindset, the pathology that's going on inside the mind of these races. But one other thing I wanted to mention, that on page 164, it said that each black stranger moving through the new social and economic landscape became a potential rapist in the eyes of suspicious whites. And he goes on to tell about the way the newspapers, added to this and encouraged this type of environment and perception of black people. And it's interesting, too, that as Tillman became governor in 1890, the numbers of lynching increased. And like you said, why would he start talking? It looks like a racist ploy to where he's talking against lynching, and lynchings are increasing. And then there's no prosecution because they're saying that the mob is unknown. These are unknown. So he's at the highest level of law enforcement in the state, and he's allowing it, and then at the same time talking against it. But I'll mute my line. Just goes to show the deceptiveness of white supremacy.
Master deceivers. Master deceivers. Just wanted to get in for Black Self-Respect on 163. He writes, one night in June 1892, when a white Edgefield man named John Paul mounted the porch of a black man's home and identified himself by name, the people inside shot and killed him. They had prepared to defend themselves against such depredations and thought that they were being attacked by members of the White Cap organization, a newspaper explained. That is, they knew Paul by name, believed him to be a white cap, and shot him. Paul was buried by his comrades of the Edgefield Rifles, a former red shirt unit and now integrated into the state militia. Black self-respect. And again, that's what I say every time when people say that black people are chumps and cowards and haven't fought back. This is in 19th century South Carolina. I mean, this is like before Rosewood. Like, this is the type of thing that they could have come and probably burned the whole town down for this sort of act. Black self-respect, and there have been several examples in the book. This is sort of thing that I mean. Every time somebody says that black people are just cowards and we just take whatever white people dish out, that should be immediately contested. And in my view, anybody who says that, you have totally lost all credibility. You should hush and do some studying. Do folks have any other?
Yes, sir.
Go ahead.
Yes, sir. You're exactly right. I mean, it's just common sense. If anyone did any studying from that period of time, it wasn't any grocery stores or anything like that available around. So to have a firearm was a necessity of having a shovel or some other tool, because you had to go out there and acquire your own food source. And in turn, as far as any concept of some sort of organized law enforcement, it's obvious we still have problems with that today. So we're talking about 150 years ago, but that was also known. So just off of that alone was the in my mind, a natural understanding of a male with a quote unquote family or people that are around him in the same spot, that when it comes to protection, I am the person that's going to have to do it. So, I mean, just common sense would tell someone that black people initiated self-respect at that level. I was reading a book that described that during that period of time, especially. And I hope I'm making sense on what I'm saying as far as the necessity of having a firearm. And I mean, even from the standpoint of, you out in the rural area, you need a firearm. So that's known that black people were defending themselves and their families during that time. You didn't have no 911 system. Not saying that it's useful now as it probably wasn't useful back during that time, let alone us being able to use it. But back to the white caps thing that you asked. I don't know what the trademark process was back during that time, but it probably wasn't as organized as it is now. With someone, if you have like a particular group or organization that somebody couldn't copy exactly what you were doing as far as a name is concerned. But I would just figure that you have so many white people who were dedicated to mistreating non-white black people that you're going to have all different sort of names, but each one of them is going to have the effort to significantly identify on what we, quote unquote, as white people who choose to terrorize black people, that would be their defining point, and they would call it, give it all different types of names, and colors would be involved in it, perhaps, that sort of thing. I mean, and it's been a long history of that, not only in this part of the world, but all over the world. I mean, in Nazi Germany, there was different organizations. They had different types of names, the brown shirts, the Gestapo, that sort of thing. And so it's a similar situation. And I mean, it's obvious to me. This book is helpful because it just tells you that white people are the experts on terrorism. I mean, they point the finger at everybody else other than white to date. But this book clearly defines for me on the authors and the people who have the most understanding of how to terrorize and mistreat people in an organized fashion. Thank you.
Right on. More of that to come throughout the book. Did any of the other callers have anything else? We got about 3 minutes left before we get to the second audio segment. Anything else folks want to make sure they get in?
Can I be heard?
Yes, sir.
I was thinking about also about the question you asked about the red caps. And earlier today, I was listening to the episode that you had with Dr. Laila Africa, and he talked about white people's theft of basically everything they have. And I thought about how they pervert everything, because the colors red, white, and blue were the oldest known use of that was in the Nile Valley. And now those are the colors of subjugation for America, Britain, Australia, and the white caps. I think they adopt color symbolism, just like the red shirts adopted the color red. And it was basically the perversion. It's like a perversion. Everything that they see, they commandeer it, and then they pervert it. So everything gets ugly when it gets into their hands. And I think the white cap thing is just another aspect of symbolic, just theft of symbolism, and then perverting it into something that basically speaks of white supremacy and terrorizing non-white people. I'll mute my line.
Right on. Appreciate that.
Yes,
sir.
I have one last comment.
Go ahead.
At the bottom of 168 and the top of 169, Tillman attempted to reconcile the rule of law and white supremacy justice by claiming leadership within both systems. At 1892 Stump meeting, he declared that although he opposed lynching, he would himself willingly lead a mob in lynching a Negro that had committed an assault upon a white woman. The authority of his position would render the lynching quasi-official. At the same time, his pledge to lead the mob reestablished him as an arbitrator of white supremacy justice. Limiting such legalization to cases of rape or attempted rape, Tillman was able violently to defend white supremacy, but without appearing indiscriminately bloodthirsty. The tactic seemed to meet with his supporters' approval, and At an Abbeville campaign meeting later that summer, supporters presented Tillman with a banner hailing him as the champion of white men's rule and women's virtue. I'll mute my line.
That is pretty wild. That's what I mean about the, excuse me, being explicit. I mean, if you can just imagine that, a banner, champion of white men's rule and women's virtue. To have that, I mean, make it plain what we're on. And I guess the only thing that I would say is that he does have a lot about white male patriarchy, and that sentence certainly is speaking to white male domination. But I have concluded white males, white females, they are equal partners in their system of terrorism. And when he's talking about these lynchings and what have you in defense of white womanhood, that frequently these white women have lied, raped non-white people, concocted what we master deceivers that instigated these white male mobs, terrorist assaults on black people, sometimes even whole black towns. So I do not, in my opinion, that is not something that is solidifying white male authority over white women. If anything, that is showing that one white woman, the lie of one white woman, can eviscerate an entire black town. And it just, again, reaffirms what I have said, that no one can galvanize white violence like white women. And I will stop there. If you have comments you want to share, jot them down. We should have time if folks want to participate after the second audio segment concludes. We are on 169, and that's where we left off at, champion of white men's rule and women's virtue. And then we start with chapter 2, Ben Tillman, the Reconstruction, Ben Tillman and the Reconstruction of White Supremacy, Context of White Supremacy. Sorry about that. I stopped it just because I think we might have missed a section, so I just want to make sure that I catch up to include any portion that we might have missed from the text. Glad that folks spoke up. Like I said, I had my button muted. Okay, so on 169, after the banner champion of white men's rule, Tillman's justification of lynching raised questions about his commitment to equality under the law, as well as his commitment to the law itself. The Charleston News and Courier began to dub him the state's mob law governor, and Tillman soon amended his pledge to justify the lynching of any man of any color who assaults a virtuous woman of any color. This gesture toward a statesman-like colorblindness fooled no one. Tillman conceivably might have argued that Joe Gibson's wife Kitty deserved this kind of protection, but only because she was part of his household, his family, black and white. In general terms, there was no such thing for Tillman as virtuous black womanhood. For him and most whites, the qualifier had a racially restrictive connotation. For Tillman, the protection of women's virtue did not imply that white women were or should be fragile or helpless. White women could be simultaneously productive and virtuous, and white men ought to foster each attribute in its own way. Even as he suggested that white women needed white men's physical protection, Tillman was working to establish a college that would enable at least some white women to achieve a measure of economic independence. It was true that he believed white women's aspirations ought to have limits. In particular, they had no place in the realm of electoral politics, where white male citizens battled dissidents and interlopers. But this was hardly an exceptional position for a Southern Democratic politician to take. Even white women who vocally disagreed with Tillman about women suffrage agreed that virtue and utility could go hand in hand. Georgia's Rebecca Latimer Felton, for example, argued that white women should become educated and should exercise considerable economic autonomy. She also made the famous declaration that if it needs lynching to protect woman's dearest possession from the ravening human beasts, then I say lynch 1,000 times a week if necessary. Tillman could not have put it better. For him, the reconstruction of the white patriarchal household required fending off intrusions from without and rebuilding economic independence from within, lynching black men and uplifting white women not onto a pedestal but into productive work roles could both serve this end. Lynching did, however, work to establish the boundaries of white female respectability. When Jake Davis, a black man, was lynched for allegedly attempting to rape the wife of a respectable white A-bill man, a reporter noted that Davis had committed an assault on a white woman in this community a few years ago, but as her character was questionable, he was allowed to go unpunished. On another occasion, Tillman pardoned a convicted rapist, race unspecified, on the ground that the woman in the case was of pronounced questionable character. Like the interracial couples and the disreputable black woman beaten by whitecaps, white women whose character was questionable were not protected by white supremacist justice. Like white men who abandoned the party of redemption, such women were denied the privileges of whiteness. The limits of opposition. The main opponents of vigilante action were its principal victims, black South Carolinians. They resisted white men's attempts to humiliate, assault, or murder them, as John Paul discovered too late. In sermons, conventions, and anti-lynching indignation meetings, preachers and politicians protested that the rights of the colored people are not respected. In 1885, a group of Charleston ministers asserted that on any night a band of desperadoes may ride up to the humble cabin of an inoffensive Negro, and for some supposed wrong he may be dragged from his home and be cruelly beaten and perhaps murdered. Sometimes they took these protests further, seeking to manipulate the discourse of the law and the mob, and arguing that this climate of lawlessness reflected poorly on prominent white men's capacity for leadership. They understood that many white men found vigilante action troubling. In the last days of 1889, a mob of 50 masked white men seized 8 black men, 4 of whom had been accused of murdering whites, from the Barnwell jail and shot them to death. As elsewhere in the post-Reconstruction South, the coroner's jury declared itself utterly ignorant of who might have committed the crime. The Charleston News and Courier, struggling to find an editorial line that upheld both white supremacy and regional respectability, ended up simultaneously decrying the lynching as the work of a mob who threatened to disorganize society and defending Barnwell against outsiders' attacks. The county, it explained, was hardly a place of lawlessness. A New England newspaper had suggested for the lynchers numbered no more than 50, and their work had been done both in disguise and under cover of darkness. This would scarcely have been necessary in a community where the habit of lawlessness prevails, the editorialists defensively concluded. Now, we will continue with the rest of the reading. Some black South Carolinians attempted to take advantage of this uneasiness about the state's reputation. Seeking the vindication of law and order, a conference of black ministers suggested that the appearance of a white mob constituted a failure of the better classes to assert authority over the criminal classes of whites. Influential leaders among the whites of the state have either directly or indirectly advised or allowed to be taught that any treatment of the Negro that would tend to impress him with the white man's superior power in a conflict of force is justifiable. From this, irresponsible white men have obtained the notion that there are no rights for the Negro which the white man, whether worthy or unworthy, is bound to respect, when the observance of these rights is judged by a white man as in any way contrary to his personal views or prejudices. Understanding that white elites expected to be able to control white men's mobilizations, the minister concluded that the Barnwell lynching indicated the supremacy of the mob element of the Commonwealth over the law-abiding classes. Then, having exposed the failures of their would-be protectors, the ministers let the other shoe drop. They called on our people to abandon such sections of the state where lawlessness prevails and life is unsafe, and go to sections where life and property are safe. A black citizen who had been badly beaten by whites made the same point to Governor Evans in an anonymous 1895 letter, but concluded with the suggestion that there were alternatives to flight. Somebody has to protect the poor nigger, he wrote. You are the man to do it. If you don't, why, we poor devils will be obliged to appeal to those who will. Now we will either have to leave the country or get protection. As late as 1885, a meeting of black ministers had warned of a revolutionary outbreak if black men and women were not treated with respect. But by the end of that decade, an anti-lynching meeting specifically forswore violent retaliation. Even the mention of retaliation mobilized potentially murderous white anxieties. Next to the Charleston News and Courier's largely approving report on the 1889 Declaration of Peaceful Intentions was a lengthy story by the same reporter on a sudden scare among Barnwell whites that local blacks, angry about the lynching, planned to burn the town. The raw materials of such panics had not changed much over the past half-century. A wagon load of black men seen in one place, a purchase of ammunition in another, a chance remark by some old trusty colored woman who had lived with one of the best citizens of the town for years. Together, these rumors were enough to bring scores of armed white men to Barnwell from surrounding towns. It was the post-bellum version of an insurrection scare, and it betrayed the same anxiety about black power and black vengeance that slaveholders and other antebellum whites had felt. But such fear was not the exclusive province of a radical or a lower-class habit of mind. An employee of one of the town's best citizens had set off the panic, and the men who proceeded to the scene as private citizens ranged all the way up the social scale to include colonels of the militia. Black South Carolinians also sought to protest and refute the emerging rape-lynch complex. If a colored man is accused through malice of an insult to a white lady, protested ministers at an 1885 meeting, he is likely to be hung or shot down like a dog. Outrages are more aggravating, declared an African Methodist Episcopal Zion minister, when we remember that white men can insult and commit rape upon colored women, and very little, if anything, is said about it. Republican leader Robert Smalls urged a black Piedmont audience to make every white man in your town respect your women as they make you respect theirs. In 1888, blacks in white-majority Pickens County lynched a white man accused of the rape and murder of a 13-year-old black girl, repulsing white men who came to the lynching victim's aid. Nevertheless, lynching overwhelmingly remained a crime committed by whites against blacks. White opponents of lynching confronted much of the same dilemma that Tillman faced. Under both F.W. Dawson and his successor J.C. Hemphill, the Charleston News and Courier took strong stands against dueling, bulldozing, and lynching, but the paper's position on lynching was riddled with ambivalence and contradiction, and the newspaper subverted its own opposition to mob rule in ways both blatant and subtle. It denounced the December 1890 lynching of a black man accused of raping a white woman, but it questioned neither the assumption of guilt nor the sentence of death. Having committed the unpardonable sin, the lynching victim richly deserved his fate, and the paper simply protested that he should have been put to death by law. In this case, as in others, it did not expect that a fair jury would convict the lynchers. The contradictions multiplied. The News and Courier decried flippant talk of a race war, warning that the strictly material losses through any such conflict would be terrible enough. The cotton would lie unpicked in the fields, the face of the earth would remain unbroken by the plow. The paper approvingly reprinted a Florida story entitled How Blatant Idiots Get Up a War of Races, which described in mocking terms how white men's fears led to rumors of an impending racial conflict, which in turn led black men to organize in defense, culminating in an armed white mob searching the swamps with murderous intent. But the paper continued to use the term, as in a report the following year in which vague rumors from another state appeared under the headline, The Mississippi Race War. The habit of thinking of racial conflict in apocalyptic terms seems to have overridden the editor's rejections of such language. Journalists lent momentum to the mob by reporting that a crowd of men are now scouring the country, and if the accused criminal is caught, he will no doubt be disposed of. Like South Carolina newspapers on both sides of the Democratic conflict, the Charleston Daily obsessively reported lynchings, especially of black men accused of raping or attempting to rape white women. During a period when on average one lynching was being perpetrated every 3 days in the United States, the News and Courier apparently reported as many as it could. When a railroad guard shot an innocent black man, the paper called it a very deplorable event, but took the occasion to observe that it is true that the colored population of South Carolina is too large and should be reduced. The ugly joke reflected the white supremacist conundrum the paper had noted almost a decade before, that wealthy white men's imperatives as employers and Democrats could not easily be reconciled where the state's black majority was concerned. Some argued that lynching frightened away both immigrant labor and northern capital. John C. Shepard, Tillman's opponent for the governorship in 1892, charged that Tillman's espousal of mob violence meant that Northerners must steer clear of South Carolina for investments and settlement. In early 1893, the editor of the North Carolina Southern Progress wrote to ask Tillman for a brief letter stating that South Carolina is free from influences that cause investments to be unsafe. Tillman replied that vested rights and investments of all kinds are as safe in South Carolina as they are anywhere, that there was nothing whatever in the bugaboo of a possible race conflict to deter immigrants making homes or those who have money to invest, and that South Carolina was not the lawless place some alleged. The rights of Negroes are respected, he claimed, and the courts are open to them for redress the same as to whites. This reply was perhaps too much of a good thing. In outlining all the ways that South Carolina was supposed to be stable and secure, Tillman highlighted Northerners' chief anxieties about investing in Southern states. Some upper-class white men saw lynching as evidence of other white men's unfitness for democratic self-government. A few tried to impress upon their sons how shamefully many of the state's white people were acting. It is the height of folly to try to convict a white man for killing a poor Negro, claimed Orangeburg Sheriff A.M. Sally in a letter to his son, a student at the Citadel. A certain class think it is something to be proud of. It was perfectly disgusting to me to see men running after those self-declared murderers. They, the lynchers, had a perfect ovation. Editor J.C. Hempfield's uncle, James Hempfield, complained that lynchings made him doubt our fitness for government. We should quit boasting that there is no place like South Carolina. We should cover ourselves with sackcloth and ashes. The state's political factions did not divide neatly into Tillmanite radicals espousing violence and anti-Tillmanite conservatives demanding law and order. Indeed, even Tillman and Hampton, figures usually offered as archetypes of these positions, took strikingly similar stances on lynching. Tillman, as we have seen, was entirely capable of speaking the language of protection and order. By the late 1880s, Hampton could likewise serve as a model of militant patriarchy. As the former general fought to retain his Senate seat against the Tillmanite onslaught in late 1890, a supporter asked when a political faction at Washington armed and let loose throughout the state a semi-barbarous race saturated with the brutal lusts of their kind, who protected the honor of the farmers' wives and daughters. His name was Wade Hampton. Hampton himself was willing to invoke the possibility of violence when it seemed tactically prudent. Speaking against the passage of the Lodge Bill, he moved from economic concerns to unmistakable warnings. The bill, he said, would demoralize our labor, shake the confidence of capitalists, and retard forever the march of prosperity, and lead perhaps to bloodshed. Tillman's assessment of the possible consequences of the Lodge Bill differed from Hampton's only in its bluntness. I don't doubt if the effort is made to control us by Negroes, many of them will be buried, he warned. The leaders of both major Democratic factions of the 1890s reminded listeners that South Carolina's white men had gone to war twice in the last generation and would do so again if required. The Denmark lynching. Most white South Carolinians who criticized lynching did so because it challenged their notions of social harmony and white civilization. When summary hangings took place at the earliest possible opportunity after the victim had been captured, newspapers praised the calmness of the lynch mob, presenting the action as swift, rational, and just. One lynch mob that transported its victim on a train was praised for behaving so well that white women traveling on the same train had no idea of the group's purpose. At the other end of the spectrum were the mass spectacles described so often in the newspapers then as well as the historiography now, lynchings with elaborate show trials and examinations that culminated in torture, mutilation, burning, shooting, hanging, and the dismemberment of bodies for trophies. In these cases, as a mob appropriated state authority and transformed the due process of law into a white supremacist spectacle, political leaders struggled to retain or recoup their authority. In April 1893, a lynching in the Barnwell County town of Denmark demonstrated the limits both of white opposition to lynching and of Tillman's attempt to reconcile white supremacist justice with the rule of law. The press reported that Mamie Baxter, a 14-year-old from a well-to-do white farm family, had said that a strange black man had attempted to assault her, presumably with intent to rape. Hastily, deputized posses brought a score of suspects before her, black men with no immediate alibi or regular local employment. All were exonerated and released. Finally, a black man named Henry Williams was identified by Baxter as somewhat resembling the man who had attacked her. Williams escaped custody, whereupon Tillman offered a $250 reward for his capture and return to the sheriff. white citizens matched that sum, conditional upon only his capture. Williams was caught but not delivered to the sheriff. In the days after Williams' reapprehension, newspaper accounts depicted Barnwell State Senator S.G. Mayfield playing the same role that Tillman had sought, that of the local statesman attempting to guide and thereby legitimate the actions of the crowd. Mayfield was among the prominent citizens who initially convinced a crowd of local whites, itself composed of many of the best citizens of the town and section, not to lynch Williams on the spot. But Mayfield, like Tillman, understood the terms of the negotiation. As he held Williams under guard in his office, he wrote to Tillman that the crime warranted death, and that if Williams was guilty, he should be lynched as soon as possible. Mayfield announced that in response to an ambiguous letter from Tillman, he had told the governor that Barnwell men would protect their women at all hazards. Local honor and white patriarchy were at stake. Tillman's letter to Mayfield, written while Williams was still at large, fully expressed the governor's precarious position between the white collective violence on which he had built his career and the state power he now embodied. Tillman had been hoping to hear that you have caught and lynched the would-be ravisher. He agreed with Mayfield that the punishment for the attempt to ravish ought to be death, and that the legal punishment is inadequate for a case of this kind. But he insisted that he would make good on the promised reward only if Williams was not lynched, for he would not consider it right to have a man caught by process of law and through the instrumentality of the reward offered by the state simply to break the law by killing him. Therefore, Tillman thought that any lynching ought to be before the officers of the law get possession of the victim. Tillman tried to make his pro-lynching position clear without appearing to use the law itself to promote a lynching. Although he saw very well what the result will be, he looked to Mayfield to preserve the proprieties. Mayfield was more concerned with his own version of the same dance. He assured the governor only that I will do in my power to lynch the man who did the deed, and as much to prevent violence to one who is not guilty. Elites like Mayfield and Tillman sought to appear gravely law-abiding while they arranged a lynching, but other participants had less power to shape or contest their depictions in the process. According to the Charleston News and Courier, unreasonable, violent, disreputable rural whites were the real perpetrators of lynching. White men from the surrounding countryside, it reported, continued to pour into Denmark, gathering in angry knots, armed with every imaginable weapon, from the double-barreled shotgun to the most antiquated make of revolvers. The mayor, sensing danger, ordered the saloons closed, hoping to ensure that the crowd would remain orderly. But the mayor, the senator, and the fair-minded men who stood with them reportedly faced a challenge from these new arrivals, men who would listen to no reason. The sentiments of this party, explained a correspondent of the state's leading newspaper, were given voice by their leader, a hard-featured, horny-handed old farmer, tall, raw-boned, clean-shaven except for a long chin whisker, which he furtively curried from time to time with one bony hand. His position was uncomplicated. Gentlemen, Barnwell's reputation is at stake, and somebody has got to die. White supremacist justice bore the same carnival resemblance to due process that white supremacist politics bore to democracy. Before a court of the mob, Williams was instructed to prove his innocence or be presumed guilty. As a reporter put it, he was in the hands of the people and was above and beyond legal interference by the governor or militia. Half an hour before Williams was to be killed, however, 4 white men, including Orangeburg Sheriff A.M. Sally, who decried lynching in the letter to his son quoted previously, arrived to corroborate an alibi Williams had been claiming since his capture. Mayfield, playing the role of judge, allowed these respectable white men to make statements and be cross-examined by the crowd. After the men had offered this evidence supporting Williams' story, Mayfield declared, "Gentlemen, you have heard the evidence. This case is in your hands. Is he guilty or not guilty?" Although some members urged that Williams be lynched, others were sobered by the new evidence, and the decision was made to keep Williams locked up while bands of men scoured the countryside for black men fitting Baxter's description of her assailant. Tillman's involvement in the case became even more direct when a suspect named John Peterson appealed to him for protection. Peterson said that he had an alibi and could prove his innocence, but he feared he would be lynched if he was captured and taken to Denmark by a posse. Tillman sent Peterson to Denmark with a single guard, ostensibly to prove his innocence. When Peterson arrived, however, according to a correspondent, the prisoner was placed upon the stand and made his statement. Evidence was taken on both sides, and the prisoner permitted to cross-examine the witness. Neither Peterson's testimony nor the governor's guard saved him. The jury of public opinion passed upon his case, and the verdict was guilty. The mob hung Peterson and shot him to death. The coroner's jury eschewed the customary formulation of persons unknown, stating simply that Peterson came to his death at the hands of about 500 citizens who intended to inflict the punishment of death for having assaulted Miss Mamie Baxter with intent to commit rape. At Tillman's request, Mayfield sent him a summary of the lynching and the verdict. Both men essentially granted the mob the authority of the state. Black and white spokesmen exploded with outrage at both the lynchers and the governor, who seemed to have aided and abetted them. A self-described mass meeting of black citizens in Columbia protested the brutal acts of barbarous mobs, as well as the collusion and sanction of state officials. The resolutions thanked the better class of our white citizens for condemning these acts, but in their deliberations, some black spokesmen took much stronger and more specific positions. "We have nothing more or less in South Carolina than mobocracy," declared Professor J.W. Morris. Some called for a denunciation of Tillman's actions. Others went further, suggesting open defiance. "In the present condition," announced Reverend H.M. Rayford, "I don't regard my life as my own. It's better to die plucky than die a coward." A Charleston protest meeting led by black preachers advised black people to be order-loving and law-abiding citizens, but added that the time is quite at hand for the men of the Negro race to make special provision for the protection of themselves and families against these outrages which may at any time be visited upon them. But black South Carolinians knew that even appearing to mobilize for physical resistance often elicited a massively disproportionate white response. Their experiences both before and after emancipation had taught them that taking up arms collectively without reliable legal and military support was a recipe for massacre. Even Tillman thought this lesson had been sufficiently taught. In the aftermath of the Denmark lynching, he soothed a subordinate's fears by reassuring him that he did not believe the sensational reports of Negroes trying to rescue rapists. Indignation meetings of leading black citizens were a part of the political landscape of Columbia and Charleston, but the participation of prominent white citizens struck many as a foolhardy escalation. Among whites, the loudest condemnation of the Denmark lynching came from editor Narciso Gonzalez, whose intolerance of vigilante violence reinforced his long hostility towards Tillman. In editorials in his anti-Tillman paper, The Columbia State, and at a biracial indignation meeting in Columbia, Gonzalez declared that lynching would not end rape or put guards on the roads to protect white women. Rather, it would incite black men to express their rage at such injustice by committing further rapes. In this unforgivingly partisan world, however, prediction was tantamount to advocacy. One newspaper denounced the indignation meeting at which Gonzalez spoke as an exhibition of blind, bitter, partisan hate and unscrupulous recklessness of consequences the worst that has ever been seen in South Carolina, condemning it for promoting race antagonism and emboldening black men to perpetrate 4 subsequent outrages. This was the white supremacist argument of the 1870s and 1880s, revived in a new context. Black men were the brutish tools through which malevolent white men attacked white farmers' households, authority, and independence, and white men who encouraged them were accessories to those crimes. The actions of Gonzalez and a few other outspoken contrarians provoked a backlash among some of the white citizens of Barnwell County. 500 attended a mass meeting in Denmark on the 29th of April, at which speakers condemned Gonzalez and his newspaper for attempting to besmirch and befoul the people of this community and incite black men to retaliatory assaults on white women. Gonzalez, they resolved, had a heart blacker than the wretch who assaulted Miss Baxter, and deserved the same fate as John Peterson. At another meeting in the town of Barnwell, 300 citizens and about 25 colored men heard speeches from Mayfield and others before resolving to lynch any future rapists. Stating explicitly the formula of local collective authority, they declared that the government was made for the people and the whole people are a law unto themselves, and that justice is more essential than mere forms of justice, and that the verdict of a jury of 500 men, the repute of whom was good, if not better than that of Gonzalez, of the state, is entitled to as much respect as a verdict of 12 of the men in a courtroom. Black rapists and white journalists who encouraged them deserved to fall at the hands of an outraged people. Although many newspapers criticized Tillman's actions, most agreed with the Edgefield Advertiser that the people of Denmark and Barnwell were, by common consent in such cases, the sole judges of Peterson's guilt or innocence. Tillman, for his part, denied bearing any responsibility for Peterson's murder. He declared that had Peterson confessed his guilt to him, he would have sent him under heavier guard or held him in Columbia, but since the man said he could prove his innocence and the mob had released other innocent men, Tillman had no reason to expect trouble. Tillman both validated and disavowed the court of Judge Lynch. Although his words implied that the mob would not have lynched Peterson if he had been innocent, he declared that the people of Barnwell had violated his confidence. He had assumed that they most certainly would not hang a man who said he was innocent and was willing to meet his accusers. Having facilitated a murderous white supremacist spectacle without unduly dirtying the hands of the state, he went on to defend the state before its northern critics. When the Boston Transcript headlined an article on the Denmark lynching, Brute Rule in the South, Tillman denounced the article as a tissue of falsehoods. He paid little further attention to South Carolinians who condemned his role in the Denmark lynching. As lynchings multiplied, the Charleston News and Courier continued to denounce the spirit of lawlessness and to hope that someone would make an example for once of some of the members of a mob. But its writers increasingly seemed to accept the futility of their insistence on law and order. As a solution, they proposed that special courts be held in areas where lynchings seemed imminent to lend the proceedings a veneer of legality. The question was not the punishment, only death would suffice, but the forms preceding its administration. If the legislature will not provide a special court for the prompt trial and punishment of rapists, the people will, declared the paper, echoing the words of the defenders of the Denmark lynching. After all, a hasty trial was better than none. Adherence to the forms of law, it seemed, might be sufficient to protect the state's reputation, if not its citizens' lives. By the mid-1890s, law and order for blacks accused of serious crimes meant little more than a quiet, orderly mob. The lynching began, one editorial, was conducted in a way that reflects great credit on the persons engaged in it. The victim was given time to prepare for his death, with no bloodthirsty mob crying out for vengeance. In fact, the crowd was composed of the best men of the community and was orderly to the last. If law could not be maintained, order would do. Savagery does not repress savagery. The paper wrote of another orderly lynching that year. It was a good example for other and all lynchers in the future. Even particularly macabre lynchings, those in which victims were tortured to death or in which trophies or souvenir photos were taken, could seem comparatively moderate. One victim begged not to be burned alive, reported the Edgefield Advertiser, and some cool heads prevented such a horrible tragedy. His murder nonetheless followed, carried out with what one reporter called a refinement of cruelty and torture that nearly everyone who witnessed it thought deserved. By the bloody summer of 1893, atrocity had become a relative concept, and black protests soon no longer drew even rhetorical sympathy from white spokesmen. The Charleston News and Courier abandoned its support for the protests of black ministers and other citizens. Instead, it characterized such protests as inflammatory and suggested that ministers' time would be better spent trying to make the men of the Negro race behave themselves. There is evidently a wide field for mission work in the country districts. Some whites also tried to blunt the brutal racial edge of spectacular lynchings by implicating black South Carolinians. Democratic newspapers took pains to point out the presence of black men and women at several lynchings of black men accused of assaulting white women during the early 1890s. Black women were said to have testified against lynching victims, and black men were spotted in the crowds among the executioners and even on the coroner's juries that reached verdicts of persons unknown. Such reports of black cooperation or participation became relatively common, perhaps revealing the underlying white insecurity manifested in the recurrent fear of an impending race war. By implicating African Americans in lynchings, these whites sought to reassure themselves that black people were not the monoliths posited by white supremacy, not a New World golem that needed only one more violent provocation to set it in murderous, retaliatory motion. Instead, these black people were a credit to white civilization, accepting the justice of its principles and helping enforce them. I thought I had unmuted my line. Apparently I had not. We'll try that again. I don't know why I'm having a problem with my mute button today. So we will pick up there next week, page 181. I thanked Tupelo, and now I can thank Demery for. I somehow did not see that my line was still muted earlier, and got a little help, needed a little help again. Thank you both. So we were picking up on 181. We have about 20 minutes left. If you would like to chime in, participate, the number again is 760-569-7676, and the code is 564-943#. Press *6 if you would like to participate. Everyone who dialed in with a hand up, you should be with us. If you would like to chime in, please don't wait till the last minute. Go ahead and get your hand up now. We have about 20 minutes left in the program. But everyone with a hand up so far, you should be with us.
Yes. First, I'd like to say that the lynching at this point is, it's horrendous. And then you have a governor who is basically pro-lynching, but he's saying that he's against it. So the state kind of follows suit with his ideology about white manhood. And so now they're terrorizing, kidnapping, and torturing black men, and with immunity. I mean, nothing is being done about it, no law enforcement agency. So then you have Ida B. Wells coming along, and, she's fighting, for against, lynching, an anti-lynching campaign. And what's interesting about it, she started at age 22, and she actually won a lawsuit against the Chesapeake and Ohio Railroad Company for being forced out of a first-class seat, although the verdict was overturned later on. But, it's interesting. She was a fighter, and she was on the forefront against lynching because it was, by far number one priority for black people at this point to address lynching, because at any time anybody could be just grabbed up and accused of raping a white woman or whatever they want to say about dishonoring a white female, and then just, done away with. And nothing would be done about it. And I thought it was the way that they tied the white supremacist so-called justice in with what they call the majesty of the law, is just phenomenal. And so that gave them the right to just do whatever. It was a mob mentality. Bill Tillman was acting as a godfather, and they were doing a lot of atrocities. And lynching at this time was one of the biggest concerns. I'll mute my line.
Gus?
Yes, ma'am.
Oh, good evening. I wasn't going to call in, but when I, was listening to the audio and, all the accusations of rape against black men and presenting that image of a black male as a brute. I think I mentioned on the cows once before about Bill Cosby. I am very much in support of women's issues, but I am also black. And I think putting 35 women on the cover of a magazine, mostly white women, accusing a black man of rape without any real evidence is very much indicative of what we're discussing tonight. I don't think if Cosby were a white celebrity, they would have done that. As a matter of fact, the whole thing behind domestic violence with O.J. Simpson, it wasn't because suddenly America was concerned about domestic violence. They were upset at O.J. Simpson because he allegedly killed a white woman. because I think I mentioned this on your show that, Jack Nicholson beat 2 women at his mansion, and not too long after the O.J. incident, and he was awarded with an Academy Award. It's never been publicized, but you can go on Smoking Gun and read about it. So it's this constant, it's this constant propagating of black males as thugs and as brutes and as rapists that has never wavered. There is a program called Investigations Discovery. I don't know if I've ever mentioned this before. They do these reenactments of crimes, and every day you will see a crime on there reenacted where a black male has killed a white woman. And I don't care if the case goes back to 1970, they'll dig it up and they'll put it on and they'll reenact it. I did send a note to, what is that organization, Color of Change, about it, but I didn't hear anything from them.
Oh.
So that's basically all I wanted to say, is just to tie in the fact that that image of black males has never wavered.
Absolutely. Clarence Thomas, Herman Cain, Tiger Woods, at all. Just go. I think he even had the passage in there that it was any black male was a potential rapist. Wow. Like that.
And you can tell it's projection. They are the rapists, and they are accusing black men of what they are doing. And so, I just, as I said, I have 3 brothers. My brothers are wonderful, wonderful black men. And I worry about them all the time because of the police. I worry about, So, I don't know, Gus. Oh, and just one more thing. If you could, Mr. Emery Ford?
Demery
Is that how you
Ford.
pronounce?
Demery
He
Ford.
always has wonderful commentary, and I want to be able to hear him, but for some reason online, when he calls in and he starts talking, it sort of fades off. And I so much want to hear what he has to say because he's full of wisdom. So I don't know if there's anything that he can do or if there's anything you can do, but at any rate, thank you, Gus, for everything.
Oh, for sure. I guess that's a good plug for Demery Ford and maybe everybody to make sure we speak up, project black self-respect, and make sure we project when we're talking so that people can hear what you are sharing. So, Mr. Demery Ford and everybody else, just make sure you're speaking loud and clear, and I'll try to make sure I prompt folks if you're a little low or if you need to speak up a little bit. Right on. Any other folks with us who had a hand up who had comments they wanted to make sure they got in?
Can I be heard?
Yes, sir.
All right. There's 2 things I wanted to talk about. There's a section in the book where they say, it's on page 173 at the top. It says, the paper approvingly reprinted a Florida story entitled How Blatant Idiots Get Up in War of Races, which described in mocking terms how white men's fears led to rumors of an impending racial conflict, which in turn led black men to organize in defense, culminating in an armed white mob searching the swamps with murderous intent. The paper continued to use the term as in the report the following year, in which vague rumors from another state appeared under the headline, The Mississippi Race War. And it said the habit of thinking of racial conflict in apocalyptic terms seemed to have overridden the editor's rejections of such language. And it just gave me, it just brought to my attention just how important the media is in propaganda and setting off violent uprisings. And it made me even think about the so-called East Coast, West Coast rap war and how that was propagated by negative media, anti-black media. And it also made me think of the sad fact that black people form like Voltron to kill each other, while white people form like Voltron to kill us. And it just brought all of those examples into my head. And then there was another section on page 180. It says, by the mid-1890s, law and order for blacks accused of serious crimes meant little more than a quiet, orderly mob. The lynching began, one editorial, was conducted in a way that reflects great credit on the persons engaged in it. The victim was given time to prepare for his death with no bloodthirsty mob crying out for vengeance. In fact, the crowd was composed of the best men of the community and was orderly to the last. If law could not be maintained, order would do. Savagery does not repress savagery, the paper wrote of another orderly, in quotes, lynching that year. It was a good example for others and all lynches in the future. This is some real psychopathology right here. Just the whole idea of the orderly murdering of innocent black men is just debased and sick. And the way that they speak about orderly savagery and then also speaking for future lynchers. So it just brings home the understanding that they never expected this to end, and it really hasn't. If you look at the way we're treated, we're probably killed more now than we ever were killed back then. And now it's just televised, like you said, on YouTube and on the news and wherever else you can see it. But it just shows you their psychopathology, and it brings me back to the episode I heard earlier with Dr. Laila Africa when he talks about the post-traumatic cave syndrome and that whole mentality and how it plays out, because this is a prime example of just how sick they are as a collective group, and we need to keep all of these things at the forefront of our minds whenever we encounter them, wherever we are. And I'll mute my line there. Thank you very much, Gus, for this one.
Absolutely chilling passage there. Any of the other folks who had a hand up, y'all have commentary? Any of the other folks that had a hand up? Do y'all have anything, or folks content that are listening? Okay. I'll get out a few comments, and then if folks have anything else that they want to get in. I think the passage that he just read, that's not quite, the threat of Negro domination hangs over us like the sword of Damocles. It's not quite there, but that passage that the previous caller just shared is pretty close. That is, I mean, a chilling indictment of white pathology. And in my view, I think that right there really gets to the core in terms of codification. I mean, when Dr. Cambon, when he talks about we should not think of white people as being ignorant or stupid, we should think of them as being scientific terrorists. That right there is scientific terrorism. It's 180. Okay, so 180. That's one thing that I will say. I mean, I have great respect for hard copy books and being able to touch the pages and all that, but it is a little easier to navigate sometimes for the e-version. But that notwithstanding, 180, where the make sure I get the... Okay, when they say that this is kind of the middle of the page. One victim begged not to be burned alive, report the Edgefield and some cool heads prevented such a horrible tragedy. His murder nonetheless followed, carried out by what one reporter called a refinement of cruelty and torture that nearly everyone who witnessed it thought... Now, that's another one right there. Direct quote, that's in the newspaper. By the bloody summer of 1893, atrocity had become a relative concept, and black protests soon no longer drew even rhetorical sympathy from white spokesmen. That is amazing. And I think you are about to see that again right now, 2015. In fact, I'm going to read that again, and you can put up Ferguson, what's going on right now in Cincinnati, Sandra Bland, insert name, Tamir Rice, Eric Garner, Michael Brown, Marlene Pinnock, Renisha McDowell, whatever you're upset about with regards to racism, white supremacy. That sentence again, by the bloody summer of 1893, atrocity had become a relative concept, and black protests soon no longer drew even rhetorical sympathy. Even that right there. Rhetorical sympathy from white spokesmen. Amazing sentence. And I think when Lasha, she emailed me today, I think in 2012 or 2013, somewhere in there, she had been using the concept of 21st century post-Reconstruction, saying that we're about to be in for a period of repetition. We have all these white people who are upset and saying that they're losing the country and President Obama and all this other stuff. And they are going to respond in a similar manner as the way white people, like Ben Tillman, responded after the period of Reconstruction. And I think that right there, I think you're gonna start to see more and more of that, because I just don't see white people discontinuing their terrorism against black people. There were some other we had lots of black self-respect in this section. Amidst all of the chaos and violence, lots and lots of black self-respect. On 171, let's see. Let's see. Black citizens been badly beaten and made the same point. Government meeting of black ministers. Okay, as late as 1885, a meeting of black ministers had warned of a revolutionary outbreak if black men and women were not treated with respect. But by the end of that decade, an anti-lynching meeting specifically forswore violent retaliation. Even the mention of retaliation mobilized potentially murderous white anxieties. Next to Charleston News and Courier's largely approving report on the 1889 Declaration of Peaceful Intentions was a lengthy story by the same report on a sudden scare among Barnwell whites that local blacks angry about the lynching planned to burn the town. And he goes on to talk about we've heard a lot of that. These the threat of Negro domination hangs over us. There's been a lot of that throughout the text, but I thought that reminded me, I think, in the book, both of the books, We Will Shoot Back, Dr. Emoja, he was on the program kind of the end of 2014, and Dr. William Cobb, or I don't know if he's Charles Cobb, Charles Cobb, I don't think he's a doctor, but he wrote the book, That Nonviolent Stuff Will Get You Killed. He also was on towards the end of 2014. But both of them talked about the long, illustrious history of black self-defense, and they both had that same sentiment that black people could maybe do retaliation, definitely not going out on the offensive to attack white people, and even self-defense at times could be dangerous because just that notion could bring down the full brunt of white terrorism. So that's something that I think is very important. Particularly sometimes people get a little reckless when they, start talking about counter-violence and not being truthful about the differential of power between white people and black people. Let's see. Also thought a couple others. There were a couple others on 171, just in terms of black people who were not going to just lay down and take it. I think it's on 170. Oh, I got it. 173. I'm still on the wrong page. 173, where he says, I thought this was an incident of the white author practicing racism. On 173, where he says, so there was a lynching like South Carolina newspapers on both sides of the Democratic conflict. The Charleston Daily obsessively reported lynchings, especially of black men accused of raping or attempting to rape white women during a period when on average one lynching was being perpetrated every 3 days in the United States. The News and Courier apparently reported as many as it could. When a railroad guard shot an innocent black man, the paper called it a very deplorable event, but took the occasion to observe, it is true that the colored population of South Carolina is too large and should be reduced. The ugly joke reflected the white supremacist conundrum. I don't think that was a joke. I think that they were being truthful about their feelings. I've said I think many times over, I think he's brought this point up many times over in the text as well, that there is a significant, a heavy population of black people in the state of South Carolina. White people are actually outnumbered by black people in the state of South Carolina. So that has a big impact on the psyche and even, these irrational fears about rape and insurrection and Negro domination. The heavy presence of melanin in this area. But I think that was not a joke, and I would submit that might be another act. Stephen Kantrowitz, the white author, suggesting that this was a joke, them saying that the quote-unquote colored population in South Carolina needed to be reduced. On 172, that's what we have. Black self-respect. I couldn't believe this. In 1888, blacks in white-majority Pickens County lynched a white man accused of the rape and murder of a 13-year-old black girl, repulsing white men who came to the lynching victim's aid. He does go on to say, if this lynching was overwhelmingly white terrorism against black people, of course, but another illustration of black self-respect. And even earlier up in the passage where it reads, black South Carolinians also sought to protect and refute the emerging rape lynch complex. If a colored man is accused through malice of an insult to a white lady, protested ministers at the 1885 meeting, he is likely to be hung or shot down like a dog. Outrages are more aggravating, declared an African Methodist Episcopal Zion minister, when we remember that white men can insult and commit rape upon colored women, and very little, if anything, is said about it. Republican leader Robert Smalls urged a black Piedmont audience to make every white man in your town respect your women as they make you respect theirs. Excellent illustrations of, I said they're all through the book. That's, again, I can own this anytime you hear any non-white person victim of racism say that, black people are chumps, cowards, we haven't done anything, we just take it, that should be challenged. I'm not going to tell you what to say or what have you, but people should speak up. There are just too many illustrations of black people who have fought, died, and used counter-violence, done everything that they possibly could to fight against racism, white supremacy, and that's total disrespect to our black ancestors and even people that are here right now who have done everything that they could, including taking white lives in order to end racism, white supremacy. The person that dialed in 9715, did you have a comment you wanted to get in?
Yes. Hi. Can I be heard?
Yes, sir.
I just wanted to thank you, Gus T Renegade, for the show that you have been helping us all out in order to just understand the context that we're in and that we're dealing with, really the matrix that we're in. Just a few observations briefly from my life. I'm working at a coffee shop in Orange County, California, and suddenly the topic that I'm discussing with my coworkers comes to why there are so many white pickup trucks in Orange County, and you have these white.
I just wanted to hop in because is this related to the book we're talking about, Ben Tillman, Reconstruction of White Supremacy?
No, actually, I just called in. Yeah.
Oh, okay. This is our book study session. I'm glad you called in. Are you a first time caller?
Yes.
Oh, okay. Right on. That is awesome.
Yeah.
I'm still on vacation. For folks who are out there, we're doing the book study session, but I'm still on vacation.
Oh, yeah.
So since I'm on vacation, I will give you the last word so you could wrap us up. You can share your story, but this is our book study session, so we don't just have random commentary and what have you. It would be focused on the book that we're talking about.
I'm so sorry.
No apology. I will give you. We'll hear your coffee shop story on the white pickup trucks. Just before we get that, anybody have any book related that they want to get in?
Yes.
Go ahead, Mr. Demery Ford.
Yes, I'd like to make one quick last point. On page 180, the Democratic newspapers took pains to point out the presence of black men and women at several lynchings of black men accused of assaulting white women during the early 1890s. Black women were said to have testified against lynching victims, and black men were spotted in the crowd among the executors and even on the coroner's duties that reach verdicts of persons unknown. The system never fails to find a black person or put the microphone in front of a black person that can put down another black person, or to show that black people or participating in their own genocide and their own destruction. So this is just another ploy of the system of white supremacy, and I just thought it should be brought out. Thanks for taking the call, bro.
Anybody have anything else they wanted to get in book related before we wrap things up? Okay, I will assume folks are good. I think I mentioned this point last week that you see the mentality of white people in this book, because even when they have like a disagreement, right, with another white person, that white person loses their status as white. It's somehow they are a white Negro, or they had these other terms. Even Ben Tillman, when he went to, I think it was the University of South Carolina, I think that was either last week or the week before, but he went there and they didn't like him, and they said, we'll hang you by our sour apple tree, where they're going to lynch him because they don't like him, they disagree with his politics. That is fascinating. That's the only way that they can conceive of difference. It has to be in racial terms. That's the way that they think. That just, in my view, that just tells you what the dominant concept on their mind is: abuse and terrorism of black people. At any rate, we'll go ahead and hear our coffee shop story and then wrap things up. We should be picking up next week on 181, top of 181, next Friday, 8 p.m. Eastern, 5 p.m. Pacific, and we'll be in for the compensatory call-in tomorrow, 9 p.m. Eastern, 6 p.m. Pacific. Invest if you think the program is constructive. We are fundraising for the summer of 2015. Racism-notes.blogspot.com. All right. First time caller, good to hear from you. I'll give 3 minutes for you to do your coffee shop story. So if you can be concise, 3 minutes, tell your story.
Before I tell my story, can I ask, when will Dr. Francis Chris Wilson be on the next?
I'm not sure. I've been on vacation for 2 weeks, so I have not really been doing booking and all that good stuff, but I will definitely be in touch with her once I am back on the grind.
Awesome. So I was just, I'm working at a local Starbucks here, and I'm discussing with my coworkers about these white pickup trucks, and it's just really amazing because at one point I used to work part-time for the city of Irvine, and I noticed that in the parking lot, I'm seeing a sea of white pickup trucks. It's just really, I don't know, just baffling. But reading the ISIS papers and putting the connections together, I guess I just kind of like see them as perhaps as like phallus symbols. But anyway, at the coffee shop, one of my coworkers, who is a white male, the only word that he said when I was discussing this topic with him was compensation, as if he's telling me that because of their lack of genetic strength, they're trying to compensate by driving these white pickup trucks with these huge wheels, and I guess perhaps trying to show their manhood. But I don't know, it was just an observation that I had here in California. Yeah. So thank you for the platform and the opportunity, Gus T.
For sure. If you want to chime in tomorrow, because that sounded, you said this was this just you were at the coffee shop? Did you work there, or you were just hanging out at the coffee shop?
Yeah, I was actually working there, and my one of my coworkers, who's a shift supervisor, he's black, but one of my other coworkers was a white male, and when we were discussing it, it's like he already understands the way that the system is played, and yeah, so and everything that he said reminded me of what Dr. Francis Chris Wilson has been saying so brilliantly, who I think is one of the most brilliant minds of the 21st century. Yeah.
Right on. That tomorrow fits beautifully. Every Saturday, the compensatory call-in, the last portion, we do workplace racism, that sort of thing. We love to hear and to kind of get other people's perspective on that and see if they've had similar exchanges with white people or what have you. But definitely, if you want to chime in tomorrow to share some of your other insight or what you've observed on the job and what have you, definitely we'd enjoy hearing from you. And glad you were able to chime chime in today, sir.
Thank you very much.
For sure.
Thank you. Have a good night.
Thank you, sir. You do the same. Thanks to everybody for chiming in. Thanks to Pello, Mr. Demery for catching my mute button slips. And great to hear input from all the folks who called in. I hope it was a constructive investment of your Friday evening. Again, we'll be back tomorrow evening, about 24 hours. I hope everybody remains codified, safe. If you're out frolicking, enjoy the summer weather and all that good stuff. But we are still under a system of terrorism. It is no time to get reckless and be acting as though we are not under a system of total racism, white supremacy. So remain codified, remain vigilant, and definitely keep in mind that we have enemies. Those enemies are white. No alcohol if you're going to get behind the wheel. Sobriety would be best under conditions of white terrorism. That said, Creator, we ask that you help us remain patient with other black people. We ask that you help us remain patient with ourselves. Remind us to demonstrate the highest levels of black self-respect at all times, in all places, each and every time we are in contact with another black person. It has been time. Replace white supremacy with justice immediately. Cal signing out. Thanks all for tuning in.
Nigga, you so brainwashed. I'm a victim, brother. Problem. You're a victim. I'm a victim of 400 years of conditioning. Shut up. The man has programmed my conditioning. Even my conditioning has been conditioned.